What would you do if the man serving your dinner turned out to be the only thing standing between you and death? Tonight, in one of the city's most elegant restaurants, four desperate men will walk through those doors with rage in their hearts and nothing left to lose. A billionaire CEO sits alone, unaware that her past decisions have turned her into a target. And a quiet waiter, a single father hiding an extraordinary past, will have exactly 60 seconds to decide. Blend into the shadows like he's done for 3 years, or step into the fire one more time. Stay with me until the end of this story, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels across the world. The first thing Jonah Carter noticed that night wasn't the four men who walked through Lumiere's front doors at exactly 9:47 p.m. It was the silence that followed them. Restaurants have rhythms, the clink of silverware against porcelain, the low murmur of conversation floating between tables, the occasional burst of laughter from a corner booth. Lumiere was no exception. For the past 2 years, Jonah had learned every beat of this place, every subtle shift in atmosphere that marked the difference between a good night and a great one. He'd become invisible here, just another face in black and white serving food to people who rarely looked up long enough to remember his name. That's exactly how he wanted it. But when those four men entered, something fundamental changed. The conversations didn't stop, not exactly, but they stuttered, hesitated. Several diners glanced toward the entrance, their instincts picking up on something their conscious minds hadn't yet identified. Jonah, polishing wine glasses behind the bar, felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He knew that feeling. He'd spent 8 years as a crisis negotiator learning to trust it. The men looked like they dressed for the occasion, button-down shirts, dark jeans, shoes that had been polished recently but not well. They were trying to fit in, trying to look like they belonged in a place where appetizers cost more than their weekly grocery bills. But their shoulders were too tight, their jaws too set, their eyes too focused. They were here for a reason. Jonah set down the wine glass carefully, his movements deliberate and calm, even as his pulse began to quicken. Through the large windows that overlooked the city's glittering skyline, he could see his reflection, a tall, lean man in his late 30s with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of face people forgot the moment he left the room. Unremarkable. Safe. Forgettable. Exactly what he'd been cultivating since the day he turned in his badge. Table for four? Marcel, the maitre d', approached the men with his practiced smile, the one that managed to be welcoming and subtly condescending at the same time. The largest of the four, a man with a shaved head and a scar across his left eyebrow, shook his head. "We're not eating. We're here to see someone." Marcel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid Lumiere operates on a reservation-only basis. If you'd like to wait at the bar, we'll wait at a table." The man's voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that comes from years of giving orders in loud places, factory floors, construction sites, anywhere human voices had to compete with machinery. Jonah knew that voice. More specifically, he knew that kind of voice. Marcel glanced toward Antoine, the head waiter, who glanced toward Jonah. The unspoken hierarchy of the restaurant flowed through looks and subtle gestures. Antoine was wondering if he should call someone. Jonah was wondering if he should intervene. He didn't. Not yet. "Very well," Marcel said, his professional veneer never cracking. "This way, gentlemen." The men followed Marcel to a table near the center of the dining room, and that's when Jonah saw who they were looking at. Celeste Hahn sat alone at table 12, her usual spot when she came to Lumiere. Once a month, like clockwork, she'd arrive at 9:30 p.m., order the same meal, seared duck breast with blackberry reduction, and work through dinner on her tablet, occasionally taking calls that never seemed to bring good news to whoever was on the other end. She was beautiful in that sharp, untouchable way that made people think of ice sculptures or expensive knives. Mid-40s, Korean-American, with dark hair pulled back so severely it looked painful. She wore power the way other people wore perfume. Jonah had served her exactly 11 times in the 2 years he'd worked here. She'd looked at him directly, maybe twice. She never sent food back, never complimented the chef, never left more or less than exactly 18% gratuity. She was precise, efficient, and utterly self-contained. She was also, if he remembered correctly, the CEO of Park Ventures, one of the largest private equity firms in the state, And now 4 men were sitting 3 tables away from her, watching her with the intensity of people who'd spent a long time thinking about this moment. Jonah's mind started working through scenarios automatically. 8 years away from the job, and his brain still couldn't stop running threat assessments. 4 men, all physically capable, all radiating tension. 1 woman, alone, unaware. Restaurant full of witnesses, which meant they probably weren't planning anything immediately violent. But probably wasn't certainly. And in his experience, when desperate men made plans involving wealthy, powerful women, those plans rarely ended well for anyone. Jonah. Antoine appeared at his elbow, breaking his concentration. Table 7 needs their check, and Table 3 wants to know if the kitchen can prepare the salmon without butter. Tell them we can do olive oil instead, but it won't taste the same, Jonah said absently, still watching the 4 men. They'd ordered water, just water. They weren't here to eat. You okay? Antoine asked. You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe he had. A ghost of himself from a life he'd left behind in a pool of blood and broken promises. I'm fine, Jonah lied, just tired. He forced himself to turn away, to focus on his tables, to do his job. Table 7's check. Table 3's salmon. Table 9 wanted dessert menus. He moved through the motions automatically, his body on autopilot while his mind stayed locked on Table 12 and the 4 men who couldn't stop staring at Celeste Hahn. She hadn't noticed them yet. Or if she had, she gave no indication. Her fingers moved across her tablet with mechanical precision, her face betraying nothing. In another life, Jonah might have admired that kind of composure. Tonight, it just made her vulnerable. 23 minutes passed. Jonah watched the clock behind the bar tick away the seconds while he poured wine, cleared plates, smiled blandly at customers who didn't see him. The 4 men sat motionless at their table, their water untouched, their eyes never leaving Celeste Hahn. The tension in the room continued to build, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but undeniable to anyone who knew what to look for. And then, at 10:11 p.m., the largest man, the one with the scar, stood up. Jonah's body reacted before his brain fully processed what was happening. He was moving across the dining room, his path angled to intercept, even as part of him screamed that this wasn't his problem anymore, that he'd given up the right to intervene the day he'd failed to talk down Sarah Martinez from that bridge. But his feet kept moving. The man was halfway to Celeste's table when Jonah stepped into his path, positioning himself between the threat and the target with the kind of casual precision that looked accidental to everyone watching. "Excuse me, sir," Jonah said, his voice quiet and friendly. "Can I get you gentlemen anything else? Coffee? Dessert menu?" Up close, the man was even larger than Jonah had estimated. 6'3", maybe 240, most of it muscle that had started to go soft around the edges. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from too many sleepless nights and too much whiskey. His hands, calloused, scarred, working hands, were clenched into fists at his sides. "Move," the man said. "I'd be happy to," Jonah said, maintaining his pleasant expression. "Just let me know if you need anything first. The chocolate torte is exceptional tonight." I said move. The man's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. Jonah didn't move. He stood there, blocking the path, his own hands relaxed at his sides, his body language completely non-threatening. This was the first rule of crisis negotiation. Never escalate. Be the calm in the center of someone else's storm. "I recognize you, Jonah said quietly, just loud enough for the man to hear. "Trent Holloway, you used to work at Hanson Manufacturing, didn't you? About 3 years ago, I arrested you and your friends here after a bar fight at McCready's. You broke a bottle over someone's head because he said something about your boss shutting down the factory." Trent's eyes widened slightly. Recognition, surprise, and something else, maybe shame, flickered across his face. "I know you too. You're that cop, the negotiator. What the hell are you doing serving tables?" "Long story," Jonah said. "What are you doing here, Trent? That's none of your business." "Maybe not, but I'm making it my business anyway." Jonah glanced over his shoulder at Celeste, who had finally looked up from her tablet, her dark eyes taking in the scene with calculation, but no apparent fear. "Whatever you came here to do, there's a better way to handle it." "You don't know what we came here to do." "Don't I?" Jonah kept his voice level. 4 men, one target, Restaurant full of witnesses. You're not here to hurt her. If you were, you would have done it already. You're here to scare her, to make her understand something, to make her feel what you've been feeling. Trent's jaw clenched. She deserves to be scared. Maybe, Jonah conceded. But scaring her here like this? Best case scenario, you end up in jail and she goes home unscathed. Worst case, someone gets hurt. Maybe one of you, maybe her, maybe some innocent person at the wrong table. Is that what you want? What I want, Trent's voice cracked slightly. What I want is for her to understand that we're not just numbers on a spreadsheet. We're people. We had lives, families, futures. And she took all of that away with one phone call. Behind them, Jonah could hear the other three men standing up. He didn't turn around. Keeping his eyes on Trent was crucial, but he was aware of them moving closer, forming a loose semicircle. Antoine had noticed the situation now. Jonah could see him in his peripheral vision, phone in hand, probably debating whether to call the police. Not yet, Jonah thought. Give me a minute. Tell me what happened, Jonah said to Trent. What happened? Trent laughed bitterly. What happened is that her company, Park Ventures, pulled their investment from Hanson Manufacturing, said the profit margins weren't sufficient. 18 months later, the factory closed. 400 people lost their jobs, including us, including people who'd worked there for 20, 30 years, people who'd built their entire lives around that place. One of the other men spoke up, younger, maybe early 30s, with the kind of lean, wiry build that came from never having enough to eat. My wife left me, took our kid, said she couldn't watch me fall apart anymore. My daughter had to drop out of college, another said. This one was older, probably pushing 60, with gray hair and a face carved into harsh lines by disappointment. Full scholarship too. But she couldn't let me lose the house, so she came home to help with bills. The fourth man, shorter than the others but with an intensity in his eyes that made Jonah nervous, added, I supervised a crew of 23 men for 18 years, watched most of them grow up. Now I can't even look them in the eye at the grocery store. Jonah took all of this in, filing away details, building profiles. Trent was the leader, the physical threat. The younger one, Owen, if Jonah's memory was correct, was the most emotionally volatile. The older one, Rafe, carried guilt along with his anger, and the intense one, Dominic, was the one who might actually be dangerous if pushed too far. And you blame Ms. Hahn for all of this, Jonah said. Damn right we do, Trent said. It was her call, her decision. She looked at a bunch of numbers and decided we were expendable. So you came here tonight to confront her, to make her see you as real people instead of numbers. Jonah paused. Did you bring weapons? The silence that followed was answer enough. Show me, Jonah said quietly. Trent hesitated, then slowly pulled back his jacket to reveal a tire iron tucked into his belt. Owen had a wrench. Rafe had nothing, but Dominic. Dominic had a folding knife clipped to his pocket. Jonah's blood ran cold. This was worse than he'd thought. They hadn't just come to scare her. They'd come prepared for violence, even if they hadn't consciously acknowledged it. Here's what's going to happen, Jonah said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used in negotiating rooms, the one that expected to be obeyed. You're going to follow me out to the patio, all of you. Ms. Hahn is going to come with us, and we're going to have a conversation, a real one, away from all these people, away from cameras and phones and witnesses who'll testify against you later. Why would she agree to that? Dominic asked. Because I'm going to ask her to, and because she's smart enough to understand that talking is better than the alternative. Jonah finally turned to look at Celeste, who was watching the entire scene with an expression he couldn't quite read. Ms. Hahn, could you join us on the patio for a few minutes? I think these gentlemen have something they'd like to discuss with you. The dining room had gone quiet. Everyone was watching now, the drama too obvious to ignore. Antoine stood frozen with his phone, looking desperately at Jonah for guidance. Marcel had disappeared, probably to call the police, which meant they had maybe 5 minutes before the situation went from bad to impossible. Celeste Hahn stood up slowly, deliberately. She was smaller than Jonah had realized, maybe 5'4" in heels, but something about the way she moved made her seem larger. She closed her tablet, set it on the table, and walked toward them with the kind of fearless determination that suggested either incredible courage or dangerous stupidity. "The patio," she said, her voice clipped and precise. 5 minutes. "Then I'm calling the police myself." Jonah nodded and gestured toward the French doors that led to Lumiere's outdoor seating area. This time of night, in early November, the patio was closed, too cold for diners, which meant they'd have privacy. He could work with that. The 6 of them filed outside, and Jonah closed the doors behind them, cutting off the warmth and light of the restaurant. Out here, surrounded by empty tables and dying plants, with the city's indifferent skyline glittering in the distance, everything felt more real, more dangerous. The temperature had dropped into the 40s, and Celeste wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. She wore a burgundy dress that probably cost more than Jonah made in a month. But right now, in the harsh LED lighting of the patio, she just looked like a woman outnumbered and outmatched. "You have 3 minutes," she said. "Talk." Trent stepped forward. "Do you remember us? Do you remember Hanson Manufacturing?" "I remember the company," Celeste said. "I don't remember you specifically." "Of course you don't." Trent's voice was thick with bitterness. "We're not important enough to remember. We're just the collateral damage of your profit calculations." "Park Ventures invested $17 million in Hanson Manufacturing," Celeste said, her tone factual, almost clinical. "The company was losing money every quarter. The management was incompetent. The equipment was outdated. We gave them 2 years and multiple recommendations for restructuring. They implemented none of them. We withdrew our investment. That's business." "That's business." Owen's voice rose sharply. 400 families destroyed, but that's just business? 400 families made choices, Celeste countered. They chose to work for a failing company. They chose not to retrain, not to relocate, not to adapt. "I'm sorry about your personal circumstances, but I'm not responsible for them." Jonah watched the temperature rise, saw the men's hands clench, saw Dominic's fingers drift toward the knife on his belt. This was the moment when negotiations either found solid ground or collapsed entirely. "Stop," Jonah said, stepping between them again. Everyone stopped talking for a second. He looked at Trent. "You came here because you wanted her to understand what her decisions cost. You wanted her to see you as human beings, not numbers. Is that right?" Trent nodded stiffly. "And Ms. Hahn, you're defending your business decisions because from your perspective they were rational and justified. You didn't set out to hurt anyone. You were just doing your job. Is that right?" Celeste's eyes narrowed. "Who are you exactly? You're not just a waiter." "Tonight, I'm just someone trying to prevent violence," Jonah said. "And right now, both of you are talking past each other. You," he looked at the 4 men, "want acknowledgement. You want her to admit that her decisions had human consequences. And you," he turned to Celeste, "want them to understand that you're not a villain, you're a businesswoman making difficult choices in a complicated world." "Damn right we want acknowledgement," Rafe said. "My daughter gave up her dreams because of her. She doesn't get to hide behind 'that's business.'" "And what exactly do you want me to do?" Celeste asked coldly. "Apologize. Write you a check? Go back in time and make a different decision?" "We want you to care," Owen said, his voice breaking. "We want you to give a damn that people's lives fell apart because of you." Silence. Jonah watched Celeste's face, saw something flicker there, something that might have been doubt or guilt or just exhaustion. She looked at the 4 men, really looked at them, for what might have been the first time. "I do care," she said finally, quietly. "You think I don't? You think I sleep well at night knowing that every business decision I make affects real people? I lie awake thinking about the families impacted by factory closures, by layoffs, by restructuring. But caring doesn't change the math. Caring doesn't make failing companies suddenly profitable. I can't save everyone, so I do my job and I try not to drown in the guilt." It was the first real thing she'd said all night. The first admission of humanity beneath the Ice Queen exterior. Trent seemed thrown by this. "If you care, then why?" "Because caring and acting are different things," Celeste interrupted. "I have a responsibility to my investors, to my company, to the other businesses in our portfolio. If I let emotion drive my decisions, more people suffer in the long run. It's a terrible calculus, and I hate it, But it's the reality of what I do. So that's it? Dominic spoke for the first time since they'd come outside. You're just going to keep making decisions that destroy lives and we're supposed to accept it because you feel bad? No, Celeste said. You're supposed to fight back. Start a union. Lobby for better worker protections. Vote for politicians who support manufacturing. Build something new. Adapt. Survive. But coming here with weapons and intimidation? That's not fighting back. That's just making yourself into the villain of your own story. Easy for you to say from your penthouse, Trent said. I grew up in a studio apartment in Queens with my mother and 2 siblings, Celeste said sharply. My father left when I was 3. My mother cleaned office buildings at night to keep us fed. I know what it's like to be poor, to be desperate, to watch opportunities disappear. The difference is that I clawed my way out instead of looking for someone to blame. The difference, Jonah said carefully, is that you had opportunities to claw toward. These men had those opportunities taken away. Celeste looked at him sharply. Whose side are you on? The side that doesn't end with someone getting hurt tonight, Jonah said. Look, you're both right and you're both wrong. Ms. Han made a business decision that had devastating consequences for real people. That's true. And these men are responsible for their own responses to that devastation. That's also true. But right now we're standing on this freezing patio, and in about 2 minutes the police are going to arrive, and everyone's night is going to get a lot worse unless we figure out a better ending to this story. What kind of ending? Owen asked. Jonah looked at Celeste. What if you gave them something real? Not money. I don't think that's what this is really about. But acknowledgement, resources, a path forward. Such as? Celeste's tone was skeptical but not dismissive. An idea was forming in Jonah's mind, the kind of idea that negotiators learn to recognize, the moment when both sides were exhausted enough to consider compromise. Park Ventures invests in companies, right? Companies that need skilled workers. These men have decades of manufacturing experience. What if you created a retraining program, something substantial, not a token gesture, but real investment in helping displaced workers from companies you've divested from? Partner with your portfolio companies to guarantee job placements for people who complete the training. That would cost, Celeste started. Less than your annual marketing budget, Jonah interrupted, and it would turn a PR nightmare into a redemption story. Billionaire CEO creates second chances for displaced workers. You'd be a hero instead of a villain. He could see her calculating, running the numbers in her head. This was a woman who thought in terms of costs and benefits. Returns on investment. It would have to be legitimate, she said finally. Real training, real jobs, not some feel-good program that goes nowhere. We don't want charity, Trent said. It wouldn't be charity, Celeste said. It would be enlightened self-interest. I need skilled workers for my companies. You need jobs. We'd both benefit. The 4 men looked at each other, having a silent conversation in glances and subtle gestures. Jonah held his breath. This was the moment. Either they'd see the olive branch for what it was, or they'd decide it wasn't enough. And Hansen Manufacturing? Rafe asked. The 400 people who lost their jobs? I can't bring the factory back, Celeste said, but I can extend the program to any former Hansen employees who want it. 6 months of retraining, full stipend to cover living expenses, guaranteed interviews with portfolio companies upon completion. And she paused, and Jonah saw something shift in her expression. A formal acknowledgement that Park Ventures could have handled the divestment better, that we should have considered worker impact more seriously in our decision-making process. It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was close. Closer than Jonah had expected. Why? Owen asked. Why would you do this? Celeste looked at him directly. Because you're right. You're not just numbers, and maybe I need to be reminded of that more often. Jonah watched the tension slowly drain from the 4 men's shoulders. The crisis wasn't over. They'd need details, contracts, proof that this wasn't just empty promises. But the immediate danger had passed. No one was going to get hurt tonight. I need you to leave your weapons here, Jonah said quietly. All of them. On that table. Then you need to leave through the side gate, not back through the restaurant. Miss Han will have her attorney contact you tomorrow with the details of the program. But you need to leave now, before the police arrive. One by one, the men placed their makeshift weapons on the patio table: the tire iron, the wrench, the knife. Physical representations of their anger, their desperation, their pain. "Thank you," Trent said, looking at Jonah. Then, more reluctantly, to Celeste, "Thank you." They filed out through the side gate, disappearing into the November night. Jonah and Celeste stood alone on the patio, the weapons still lying on the table between them like evidence of a crime that didn't quite happen. "That was," Celeste started. "Insane?" Jonah suggested. "Reckless? Potentially disastrous?" "I was going to say impressive." She studied him with those dark, calculating eyes. "You knew exactly what to say to both sides. You de-escalated a situation that could have ended very badly. That's not a skill most waiters have." "I'm not most waiters." "Clearly." She picked up Dominic's knife, examining it. "Crisis negotiator, you said? Before you were a waiter?" "Before I was a waiter." "And you left that career because I failed someone once, and they died because of it." The words came out flat, emotionless. Jonah had practiced saying them without breaking. "I don't do that work anymore." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then, "The woman on the bridge, Sarah Martinez, 3 years ago, I read about it." Of course she had. Celeste Hahn didn't strike Jonah as someone who left questions unanswered. "She was 26 years old," Jonah said, staring at the knife in Celeste's hands. "Bipolar, off her medication. Her boyfriend had just left her. She climbed over the railing on the Westfield Bridge, and I was the one they called to talk her down. I did everything right, everything by the book. Built rapport, showed empathy, made her believe there was hope. And then..." He stopped, the memory still sharp after all this time. "A truck backfired. She startled. I reached for her, but I was too slow. She fell. That wasn't your fault. Tell that to her mother, who screamed at me at the funeral. Tell that to my daughter, who found me crying in the bathroom at 3 a.m. because I couldn't stop seeing Sarah's face. Tell that to..." He cut himself off. "It doesn't matter. I'm not that person anymore." "Aren't you?" Celeste gestured toward the gate where the 4 men had disappeared. "Because what I just witnessed looked exactly like crisis negotiation to me. You identified the threat, assessed the motivation, found common ground, and crafted a solution that satisfied both parties. That's not something you unlearn." "That was different." "How?" "Because..." Jonah struggled to articulate it. "Because I wasn't responsible this time. I was just a waiter who happened to be in the right place. Or the wrong place, I don't know." "You were exactly where you needed to be," Celeste said firmly. "And you saved more than just me tonight. You saved those 4 men from making a mistake they couldn't take back. You gave them a path forward instead of a prison sentence. That's not nothing." Through the French doors, Jonah could see the restaurant in chaos. Police had arrived, 2 officers talking to Marcel and Antoine taking statements. His co-workers kept glancing toward the patio, trying to see what was happening. His cover was blown. His quiet, invisible life was over. "I should probably get back inside," he said. "I'm about to be fired." "No, you're not." Celeste pulled out her phone. "I'll handle it." "You can't." "I'm Celeste Hahn. I can do whatever I want." She made a call, spoke briefly to someone, probably the restaurant's owner, and hung up. "You're not fired. You're a hero who prevented a violent incident. They should give you a raise." "I don't want to be a hero." "Too late." She studied him again, and Jonah got the distinct impression he was being evaluated, assessed, priced. "What if I told you I have a proposition for you?" "I'd say I'm not interested." "You haven't heard it yet." "I don't need to. I know what people like you want from people like me. You want to hire me, put me to use, make me solve problems for you, but I'm done solving problems. I serve food, I go home to my daughter, I live a simple life. That's all I want." "Is it?" Celeste's voice was gentle, almost kind. "Is that really all you want? Because from where I'm standing, you just came alive out here. For the first time in 3 years, you stopped hiding and started being who you actually are. And I think part of you misses that, misses mattering." The words hit harder than they should have. Jonah wanted to deny them, to insist that he was happy with his small, safe life. But Celeste Hahn hadn't built an empire by being blind to uncomfortable truths. Think about it, she said. I'm going to create that retraining program we discussed, but I need someone to run it, someone who understands both business and people, who can bridge the gap between workers and executives, someone who can spot potential crises before they explode into violence, someone exactly like you. I can't. You can. You just did. She handed him a business card. My private number. Call me when you're ready to stop punishing yourself for being human. She walked back into the restaurant, leaving Jonah alone on the patio with 4 abandoned weapons and a business card that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Inside, he could see the police finishing their interviews. They'd want to talk to him next, get his statement, ask him questions he didn't want to answer. His quiet, invisible life was definitely over. But as he stood there in the cold November air, with the city lights stretching out endlessly before him, and the memory of 4 desperate men who'd walked away instead of destroying themselves, Jonah felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt necessary, and that terrified him more than anything that had happened tonight. He picked up the weapons one by one, feeling their weight, their potential for harm. Tools that could have ruined lives tonight, but instead just sat on a table, unused, waiting to be taken away as evidence. In a strange way, they were perfect metaphors, objects that could build or destroy depending on who held them and why. Just like him. Just like the skills he'd buried and the man he'd tried to forget. Jonah pocketed Celeste's card and walked back into the restaurant to give his statement to the police. Tomorrow, he'd go home to Maya and pretend everything was normal. He'd make her breakfast, walk her to school, come back to work at Lumiere like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Celeste Hahn was right about that much. Tonight, for 60 minutes on a freezing patio, Jonah Carter had stopped being invisible. He'd stepped into the fire, used skills he'd sworn he'd never use again, and saved lives without losing anyone. And the most dangerous part wasn't what had happened tonight. It was that he wanted to do it again. The police interview lasted 47 minutes. Jonah sat in Marcel's office, a cramped room that smelled of expensive cologne and old paperwork, answering questions from Detective Sarah Chen, a woman in her early 50s with tired eyes and the kind of patience that came from hearing every possible variation of human stupidity. So let me get this straight, Detective Chen said, flipping through her notes. 4 men came into the restaurant with weapons, targeting a specific customer, and you, a waiter, decided to handle it yourself instead of calling us immediately. I did handle it, Jonah said. Nobody got hurt. That's not the point, Mr. Carter. You put yourself and everyone in that restaurant at risk. What if those men had been more violent? What if they'd had guns instead of tire irons? They didn't. You couldn't have known that. Yes, I could. Jonah met her gaze steadily. I'm former LAPD, Crisis Negotiation Unit, 8 years. I read the situation and made a judgment call. Detective Chen's expression shifted from irritation to recognition. Carter, Jonah Carter, you're the one who worked the Sarah Martinez case. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, and Jonah could see her recalculating, reassessing. The Martinez case had been big news 3 years ago. Local negotiator fails to save suicidal woman. Department cleared him of wrongdoing, but the headlines had been brutal. The photos of Sarah's mother screaming at him outside the courthouse had gone viral. I'm sorry, Detective Chen said finally. That must have been difficult. It was. Jonah's voice was flat. Is there anything else you need from me? The men. Do you know where they went? No. They left through the side gate. Ms. Hahn has agreed not to press charges provided they accept her offer of assistance. That's generous of her. She's a complicated woman. Detective Chen closed her notebook. Look, off the record, what you did tonight was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Maybe both, but you're lucky it worked out. Next time, call us first. There won't be a next time, Jonah said, but even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. It was past midnight when Jonah finally left the restaurant. The November air had grown even colder, and his breath formed small clouds as he walked to his car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic that had seen better decades. The passenger side door didn't lock properly anymore, and the check engine light had been on so long he'd stopped noticing it. His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter's babysitter, Mrs. Chen from the apartment next door. Maya fell asleep during her movie. I put her to bed. She wants to know if you'll make pancakes tomorrow. I said probably. Jonah smiled despite his exhaustion. Maya was 7 years old, fiercely intelligent, and absolutely convinced that pancakes could solve any problem. She'd been 4 when her mother left, too young to understand that some people weren't built for the kind of patient, grinding love that single parenthood required. Rebecca had lasted 6 months after Sarah Martinez died, watching Jonah fall apart, before she'd packed a bag and moved to Portland with a software engineer she'd met at a yoga class. "I can't save you," she'd said on her way out the door, "and I can't watch you drown." She sent money sometimes, called on Maya's birthday, tried to be a distant, ambient presence in their daughter's life. It wasn't enough, but it was more than nothing, and Jonah had learned to be grateful for small mercies. He drove through empty streets, past closed shops and flickering streetlights, his mind still churning through the events of the night, the look in Trent's eyes when he'd placed the tire iron on the table, the way Celeste's mask had cracked just enough to show the person underneath, the feeling of using skills he'd thought were dead and buried. Celeste's business card sat in his pocket like a live coal. Someone who can spot potential crises before they explode into violence. Was that what he wanted? To spend his days identifying threats, managing tensions, preventing disasters? He'd spent 3 years convincing himself that he was done with that life, that the cost was too high, that he'd rather be invisible and safe than visible and responsible. But tonight, for those 60 minutes on the patio, he'd felt like himself again. Not the broken version who couldn't sleep without seeing Sarah's face, the version who believed he could make a difference. He pulled into the parking lot of his apartment complex, a squat beige building called Vista Gardens that had neither vista nor gardens. 3rd floor, corner unit, 1 bedroom that he'd given to Maya while he slept on the couch. The rent was cheap, the neighbors were quiet, and the roof only leaked during the worst storms. It was exactly the kind of place people ended up when they'd given up on ambition. Mrs. Chen was waiting in his living room, knitting something that might have been a scarf or a very long hat. She was 73, widowed, and had decided that Jonah and Maya were her personal project. "You look terrible," she said by way of greeting. "Long night." "I heard." She set down her knitting. "Police cars at Lumiere. Someone said there was almost a shooting." "No shooting, just a misunderstanding." "The kind of misunderstanding that requires 4 police cars?" Mrs. Chen fixed him with the look that had probably terrified her children decades ago. "Jonah, what happened?" He couldn't tell her, not the whole truth. But Mrs. Chen had earned some honesty. "Some men came to the restaurant to confront a customer. I helped mediate. Everyone went home safe." "You mediated?" Her voice was skeptical. "You're a waiter." "I used to be other things." "I know what you used to be." Mrs. Chen picked up her knitting again, needles clicking in a steady rhythm. "I also know why you stopped. But hiding from the world isn't the same as healing from it, Jonah. At some point, you have to decide which version of yourself you want to be." It was the second time that night someone had told him essentially the same thing. Maybe the universe was trying to send him a message. "Maya drew another picture today," Mrs. Chen continued. "Want to guess what it was?" "Let me think." "A family?" "A family of 3. You, her, and a blank space she labeled someone else. When I asked her who someone else was, she said she didn't know yet, but she'd recognize them when they showed up." Jonah felt something twist in his chest. Maya had been drawing variations of that same picture for 2 years, her way of processing the fact that her mother was gone, that their family was incomplete. Sometimes someone else was a dog. Sometimes it was a grandmother. Once, memorably, it had been a dragon, but the space was always there, waiting to be filled. "She asked if you were happy," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that happiness is complicated and that grown-ups sometimes have to work harder to find it than kids do." She set down her knitting again and looked at him directly. "But between you and me, Jonah, you're not working to find happiness, you're working to avoid pain, and those are very different things." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Mrs. Chen gathered her knitting and stood up. "I'll see you tomorrow. Tell Maya I expect to hear all about those pancakes." After she left, Jonah checked on his daughter. Maya was curled up under her unicorn comforter, dark hair spread across her pillow, one hand clutching the stuffed bear she'd had since she was 2. In sleep, she looked impossibly young, impossibly vulnerable. He spent his life trying to protect her from the world's sharp edges, but every day she got a little older, a little more aware that their life wasn't like other people's lives. Her latest drawing sat on her desk, the family of 3. 2 figures carefully colored in, one tall, one small. The third figure was just an outline, waiting. Jonah pulled Celeste's business card from his pocket and stared at it in the dim light from Maya's nightlight. A simple card, expensive paper, raised lettering, a phone number that could change everything or ruin everything. He thought about the look on Trent's face when he'd realized someone actually saw him, actually cared about what happened to him and his friends. He thought about Celeste's admission that she lay awake thinking about the human cost of her decisions. He thought about Owen's broken voice when he talked about his wife leaving, Rafe's guilt over his daughter's lost scholarship, Dominic's shame at not being able to face his former crew. He thought about all the Trents and Owens and Rafes and Dominics out there, people standing on their own versions of bridges, one bad decision away from disaster. And he thought about Sarah Martinez, who he hadn't been fast enough to save. Maybe that's what this was really about. Not redemption. He'd never believed in redemption, not really, but something simpler. The chance to be fast enough next time. Jonah put the card on his dresser and tried to sleep on the couch. It didn't work. His mind kept replaying the night, kept finding different ways it could have gone wrong, kept circling back to the moment when he'd stepped into Trent's path and chosen to be visible again. At 3:17 a.m., he gave up on sleep and made coffee. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. This was usually his time, the hours between midnight and dawn when the world felt manageable, when he could pretend that his small life was enough. But tonight, the silence felt different, heavier, like it was waiting for him to make a decision. He picked up his phone and stared at Celeste's number for a long time. Then he set it down without calling. Too soon, too reckless. He needed to think this through properly, consider all the angles, figure out if he was actually capable of doing what she was asking, or if he was just seduced by the memory of who he used to be. The sun rose at 6:43, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost aggressively cheerful. Jonah made pancakes, chocolate chip, Maya's favorite, and woke her up at 7. "Is it Saturday?" she asked groggily. "Tuesday. We only have special pancakes on Saturday." "Today's different," Jonah said. "Today we're having Tuesday pancakes." Maya sat up, immediately suspicious. "What happened?" "Nothing happened." "Dad, you're a terrible liar." She was right. He'd never been able to hide anything from her, not since she was old enough to read faces and body language. "Something happened at work," he admitted. "But everyone's okay. And I made pancakes to celebrate everyone being okay." Maya considered this as she climbed out of bed and padded to the kitchen table. She was wearing her favorite pajamas, purple with stars, and her hair was a magnificent disaster that would require serious negotiation to tame before school. "Mrs. Chen said there were police cars," Maya said, attacking her pancakes with the focused intensity she brought to everything. "She said maybe someone tried to rob the restaurant." "Not exactly." "Then what exactly?" Jonas sat down across from her. "Some people were upset about something and I helped them talk it out. That's all. Like when you used to help people before." She remembered. Of course she remembered. Maya had been 4 when he left the force, but she had the kind of memory that filed away everything and retrieved it at inconvenient moments. Sort of like that. "Did you like it?" The question caught him off guard. "What?" "Helping them. Did you like it?" Maya looked at him with her mother's eyes, dark, perceptive, impossible to fool. "You've been sad for a long time, Dad. Sad in the way where you smile, but it doesn't reach all the way up. But this morning you look different, like maybe the smile might actually make it." 7 years old, and she could read him better than anyone. "I did like it," Jonah admitted. "It felt good to help people again, but it's complicated." "Because of the lady who fell?" His throat tightened. They'd talked about Sarah Martinez once, when Maya had found him crying and demanded to know why. He'd tried to explain it in terms a 5-year-old could understand, that he'd tried to help someone, that he'd failed, that it had hurt him very badly. Maya had hugged him and told him that trying to help was always good, even when it didn't work. At the time, he hadn't believed her. Now, sitting across from her at their cheap kitchen table with chocolate chip pancakes going cold, he wondered if maybe she'd been right all along. "Yeah," he said, "because of her." "But you helped the people last night, right? They didn't fall." "No, they didn't fall." "So maybe you're getting better at it." Out of the mouths of babes. Jonah drove Maya to school, watched her run toward the building with her backpack bouncing, then sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, staring at his phone. He had a shift at Lumiere that afternoon. He had bills to pay and a life to maintain. He had a daughter who needed stability and a father who didn't disappear into the kind of work that kept him awake at night. But he also had Celeste's number in his phone and a feeling in his chest that wouldn't go away. He called her at 9:15. She answered on the second ring. "I was wondering how long it would take you." "I haven't decided anything," Jonah said. "But you called. That's a start. Tell me about the job." Specifically, he heard papers rustling. "Community relations manager. You'd oversee the retraining program we discussed, design the curriculum, vet the candidates, coordinate with portfolio companies. But that's just the beginning. I want you to audit all of our investments for potential labor issues. Identify situations like Hansen before they explode. Mediate conflicts between management and workers. Essentially, be the human conscience of Park Ventures." "That's not a real job. That's you trying to assuage your guilt." "It's both." Celeste didn't sound offended. "But that doesn't make it less necessary. I employ 15,000 people across 12 companies. If I can prevent even a fraction of the situations like last night, that's worth it." "What's the salary?" She named a figure that was 3 times what he made at Lumiere. "That's too much." "That's what the position is worth. Take it or don't. But don't insult me by pretending I'm overvaluing your skills." Jonah watched a steady stream of parents dropping off their kids at the school. Normal people living normal lives, probably worrying about normal things like soccer practice and parent-teacher conferences. He could be one of those people. He'd been trying to be one of those people for 3 years. But maybe Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe avoiding pain wasn't the same as finding happiness. "I need to think about it," Jonah said. "You have until Friday. After that, I'm hiring someone else." Celeste paused. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're going to say no. Last night, I saw someone who'd been asleep for a long time wake up. People don't go back to sleep after that." She hung up before he could respond. Jonah drove to Lumiere in a daze. The restaurant looked different in daylight, smaller, less elegant, more ordinary. Antoine was already there, setting up for the lunch service, and when he saw Jonah, his face broke into a complicated expression somewhere between relief and concern. "Man, last night was insane," Antoine said. "Everyone's talking about how you faced down 4 armed guys like some kind of action hero." "I didn't face anyone down. I just talked to them." "That's not what Marcel's telling people. He's saying you saved Ms. Han's life." Marcel's exaggerating. "Maybe." Antoine started folding napkins with practiced efficiency. "But the owner called this morning. He wants to give you a commendation. Employee of the month, bonus, the whole thing. You're a hero, Jonah." There was that word again. Hero. Like what he'd done required some kind of exceptional courage instead of just the muscle memory of skills he'd never fully lost. "I don't want to be a hero," Jonah said. "I just want to do my job." "Which job?" Antoine looked at him knowingly. "Because I'm guessing the fancy CEO lady offered you something better than serving duck breast to people who don't say thank you. She might have mentioned something. You should take it." Antoine finished his napkin and started on another one. "Look, I like you, Jonah. You're a good waiter, you don't complain, you show up on time. But you're too smart to be doing this forever. And after last night, everyone knows you're capable of a lot more than carrying plates. What if I'm not ready? For what? The job? Or for people to see who you actually are?" It was the same question Celeste had asked, just phrased differently. The lunch shift was brutal. Every table wanted to know about the incident, wanted to hear Jonah's version of events, wanted to transform a tense negotiation into a dramatic story they could retell at their next dinner party. By 3 p.m., Jonah was exhausted from dodging questions and deflecting attention. He was clearing table 9 when his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Trent Holloway. Ms. Hahn's lawyer contacted me this morning. I don't know what you said to her, but she's actually following through. Real training, real stipends, real jobs. I just wanted to say thank you. You didn't have to help us. You could have just let the cops arrest us, but you gave us a chance instead. That means something. Then another text, this one from a different number. Jonah Carter? This is Rafe Mitchell. My daughter cried when I told her I might be able to afford to send her back to school. I haven't seen her cry happy tears in years. Thank you for giving us hope. Then Owen. Then Dominic. 4 men who'd walked into a restaurant ready to commit violence, now thanking him for helping them find a different path. Jonah stood in the middle of the dining room, phone in hand, and felt something shift inside him. Not redemption. He still didn't believe in redemption, but something simpler and more profound. The sense that maybe his skills weren't a curse. Maybe they were just skills, and maybe how he used them was still within his control. He finished his shift at 6, drove home, picked up Maya from Mrs. Chen's apartment, and made spaghetti for dinner. Maya talked about her day, a complicated story involving a kid named Marcus who'd stolen her eraser, then apologized and given her his favorite pencil as restitution. She dissected the incident with the analytical precision of a future lawyer, debating whether the pencil adequately compensated for the eraser. "What do you think, Dad?" she asked. "Is it a fair trade?" "I think Marcus is probably a good kid who made a mistake and tried to make it right," Jonah said. "Sometimes that's all we can ask of people." Maya twirled spaghetti around her fork thoughtfully. "Is that what happened last night? Someone made a mistake and you helped them make it right?" "Something like that." "Then I think you should keep doing that." "Keep doing what?" "Helping people make things right." She looked at him seriously. "You're really good at it, Dad. And when you're good at something, you're supposed to use it. That's what Mrs. Chen says. She's good at knitting, so she knits blankets for the shelter. Mr. Rodriguez is good at fixing things, so he helps everyone in the building. You're good at helping angry people stop being angry, so you should do that." It was the clearest moral philosophy Jonah had heard in years, delivered by a 7-year-old in purple pajamas with spaghetti sauce on her chin. "What if helping angry people means I'm not here as much?" Jonah asked carefully. "What if I have to work longer hours, or travel sometimes, or will you still make Tuesday pancakes?" "Always." "Then it's okay." Maya returned to her spaghetti with the matter settled. "Besides, Mrs. Chen says you've been hiding for too long. She says hiding makes people smaller, and you should be bigger." "Mrs. Chen has a lot of opinions about my life." "That's because she loves you. We both do." Maya looked up at him with absolute certainty. "And we both want you to be happy, not pretend happy, real happy." After Maya went to bed, Jonah sat on the couch with his phone in his hand and Celeste's number on the screen. It was Wednesday night. She'd given him until Friday, but he already knew what his answer would be. Maya was right. Mrs. Chen was right. Celeste was right. Even Antoine was right. He'd been hiding for 3 years, trying to make himself smaller, trying to pretend that being safe was the same as being happy. But last night, he'd remembered what it felt like to be necessary, to use his skills for something that mattered, to make a real difference in people's lives. And yes, there was risk. Yes, he might fail again. Yes, someone might get hurt despite his best efforts. But Maya deserved a father who was whole, not one who'd cut away pieces of himself to avoid pain. She deserved to see him be the person he actually was, not the person he was pretending to be. He called Celeste at 9:30. "I don't need until Friday," Jonah said when she answered. "My answer is yes." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Jonah wondered if the call had dropped. Then Celeste spoke, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Good. Be at Park Ventures tomorrow morning at 8. We'll handle the paperwork and get you started immediately. The retraining program needs to launch within 30 days if we're going to keep our commitment to those 4 men. Tomorrow? I need to give notice at Lumiere, figure out childcare, arrange. I'll have my assistant contact the restaurant. Consider it handled. As for childcare, Park Ventures has an on-site program for employees' children. Maya can come with you until you sort out something more permanent." Celeste's tone shifted, becoming more businesslike. "Jonah, when I make a decision, I move quickly. If you're going to work for me, you need to understand that. I don't wait for perfect conditions. I create them. After she hung up, Jonah sat in the darkness of his living room, the reality of what he'd just agreed to settling over him like a weight. Tomorrow morning, he would walk into one of the most prestigious investment firms in the state, not as a visitor, but as an employee. He would have an office, responsibilities, people depending on him to make decisions that affected their lives. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long exile. He spent the next hour researching Park Ventures on his laptop. The company's website was sleek and corporate, full of phrases like strategic growth partnerships and maximizing stakeholder value. There were photos of Celeste at various events, shaking hands with politicians, accepting awards, standing in front of gleaming office buildings. In every photo, she wore the same expression of controlled confidence, the mask that had only cracked for a few moments on that freezing patio. The company employed over 200 people directly, with thousands more across their portfolio of investments. They had holdings in manufacturing, technology, healthcare, real estate. On paper, Park Ventures was exactly the kind of soulless corporate entity that destroyed places like Hansen Manufacturing without a second thought. But Jonah had seen something else on that patio. He'd seen a woman who admitted she lay awake thinking about the human cost of her decisions. He'd seen someone willing to create an entire program to address a problem she could have easily ignored. That counted for something. Sleep came eventually, restless and populated by dreams of bridges and falling and voices he couldn't quite hear. He woke at 5:30, his heart racing, Sarah Martinez's face still vivid in his mind. Some ghosts, he thought, never really left. They just waited in the corners of your consciousness, ready to remind you of your failures at the worst possible moments. Maya was excited about the prospect of going to work with him, treating it like an adventure rather than a logistical necessity. She picked out her favorite dress, red with white polka dots, and insisted on wearing her smart shoes, the black flats she usually reserved for school concerts. "Do you think they'll have other kids there?" she asked, while Jonah tried to tame her hair into something resembling order. "Celeste said they have a childcare program, so probably." "What if the other kids don't like me?" "Then those kids have terrible judgment, because you're extremely likable." Maya grinned at him in the mirror. "You have to say that. You're my dad." "Doesn't make it less true." They arrived at Park Ventures at 7:45. The building was downtown, all glass and steel, rising 30 stories above the city like a monument to ambition. The lobby was cavernous, with marble floors and abstract art that probably cost more than Jonah's annual salary at Lumiere. A security guard directed them to the 23rd floor, where Celeste's executive offices were located. The elevator ride felt interminable. Maya pressed her face against the glass wall, watching the city shrink beneath them, while Jonah tried to control the nervous energy building in his chest. This was real. This was happening. He was about to walk into a world he'd spent 3 years avoiding, and there was no guarantee he was ready for it. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never heard of the concept of warmth. Everything was sharp angles and monochrome colors, aggressively modern in a way that felt more intimidating than welcoming. A young woman sat behind a curved desk, her expression professionally pleasant. "Jonah Carter," he said. "I'm here to see—" "Ms. Han is expecting you. This must be Maya." The receptionist smiled at his daughter. "Hi, sweetie. I'm Jennifer. Would you like to come with me? We have a really fun playroom with other kids your age." Maya looked at Jonah uncertainly. "Dad?" "It's okay," Jonah said, kneeling down to her level. "I'll be right upstairs. If you need me, just tell Jennifer and I'll come get you immediately. Deal?" "Deal." Maya hugged him quickly, then followed Jennifer down a hallway, her smart shoes clicking on the polished floor. Watching her walk away, trusting him to have made the right decision, Jonah felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. Every choice he made affected Maya, shaped her understanding of what was possible and what was worth fighting for. "Mr. Carter?" Another assistant appeared, this one male, probably in his late 20s, wearing a suit that cost more than Jonah's car. "I'm David. I'll take you up to Ms. Han's office." They rode another elevator up 3 more floors to the executive suite. Here, the aggressive modernity softened slightly. replaced by an aesthetic that suggested power without quite shouting it. Original artwork lined the walls, not abstract now, but portraits, faces of people who looked like they'd built empires or toppled them. Celeste's office occupied the corner, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. She was standing at one of those windows when David ushered Jonah in, her silhouette sharp against the morning light. She didn't turn immediately, and Jonah had the sense that this was calculated, a power move designed to establish hierarchy. "Do you know what I see when I look out these windows?" Celeste asked finally. "Expensive real estate?" She turned, and there was amusement in her eyes. "Opportunity. Every building down there represents thousands of people working, creating, struggling, succeeding, failing. Every decision I make ripples out into all those lives. It's exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. And you're telling me this because I want you to understand what you've signed up for. This isn't just about creating a retraining program for 4 angry men. This is about fundamentally changing how Park Ventures interacts with the human beings affected by our decisions. That's a massive undertaking, and it's going to make you unpopular with a lot of people in this building." Jonah looked around the office. The expensive furniture, the prestigious degrees framed on the wall, the subtle markers of success that Celeste had accumulated over decades of ruthless competence. "Why do I get the feeling you're trying to talk me out of this?" "I'm not. I'm making sure you understand what you're walking into." Celeste moved to her desk, a massive piece of dark wood that looked like it had been carved from a single tree. The executives here are brilliant, ambitious, and utterly convinced that emotion has no place in business decisions. They're going to see you as a threat to their way of operating. They're going to test you, undermine you, try to prove that caring about people is a luxury we can't afford. And you think I can handle that? I think you face down 4 armed men without flinching. Corporate politics should be easier. She pulled out a folder, thick with documents. "This is your employment contract, standard non-compete, confidentiality agreements, benefits package. Your official title is Vice President of Community Relations and Labor Integration. You report directly to me, which means you have authority to speak on behalf of Park Ventures in matters related to workforce issues." Vice President. Jonah had never imagined having a title like that. 3 days ago, he'd been worried about whether he could afford new shoes for Maya. "There's a clause here about media relations," Jonah said, flipping through the contract. "I don't do press." "You might have to. Part of this role involves being the public face of our new commitment to worker welfare. Press conferences, interviews, that sort of thing." "Absolutely not." Celeste leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Still running from visibility?" "I'm not running. I'm being realistic about my limitations." "Your limitation is that 3 years ago a woman died while you were trying to save her, and you've been punishing yourself for it ever since. But punishing yourself doesn't bring her back, Jonah. It just wastes the skills that could save other people." The words hit hard because they were true. Jonah set down the contract and met Celeste's gaze directly. "I'll do the job. I'll build your program, mediate your conflicts, be your human conscience, or whatever you want to call it. But I won't be your poster boy for corporate redemption. Find someone else to smile for the cameras." "Fair enough." Celeste made a note on her tablet. "For now. But eventually you're going to have to decide whether you want to help people in private or actually change the systems that create these problems in the first place. The second option requires visibility." Before Jonah could respond, there was a knock on the door. A man entered without waiting for permission. Late 50s, silver hair, expensive suit, and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He looked at Jonah with undisguised skepticism. "This is the waiter?" he said. "This is Jonah Carter, our new VP of Community Relations," Celeste corrected, her voice sharp. "Jonah, this is Richard Brennan, our Chief Financial Officer and the second largest shareholder in Park Ventures." Richard didn't offer his hand. "Celeste, can we talk? Privately?" "Anything you need to say can be said in front of Jonah. He's part of the executive team now." Richard's jaw tightened. "Fine. What the hell are you thinking? Creating an entirely new division based on one incident? Hiring someone with 0 corporate experience? This retraining program is going to cost millions. And for what? To make you feel better about a business decision you made 3 years ago?" To prevent situations like Hansen Manufacturing from happening again, Celeste said calmly. To build relationships with the communities our investments affect. To reduce the risk of labor conflicts that could damage our reputation and bottom line. It's good business, Richard. It's emotional business, and emotional business is bad business. Richard finally looked at Jonah directly. No offense, Mr. Carter, but you're in over your head. Corporate relations requires understanding finance, legal structures, stakeholder management. You talk people down from bridges. That's not the same thing. You're right, Jonah said. It's not the same thing. It's harder. Because when I fail at my job, people die. When you fail at yours, numbers on a spreadsheet change color. So maybe save the condescension for someone who's impressed by it. Richard's face flushed red. Celeste, I'm formally registering my objection to this hire. The board is going to have questions. Let them ask. Celeste stood, effectively dismissing him. And Richard, Jonah reports to me, not to you. If you have concerns about his performance, bring them to me directly. Don't undermine him to the rest of the executive team. Are we clear? Richard left without answering, slamming the door behind him hard enough to make the artwork rattle. Well, Celeste said, that went better than expected. Better? He looked like he wanted to throw me out the window. Yes, but he didn't. That's progress. Celeste pulled up something on her tablet. Richard represents the old guard of Park Ventures, the people who believe that maximizing profit is the only metric that matters. They're not bad people exactly. They're just operating from a framework that doesn't include space for human considerations. Your job is to change that framework. By doing what? Winning them over with my sparkling personality? By proving that considering human impact doesn't mean sacrificing profits. By showing them that preventing crises is cheaper than managing them. By building something so successful they can't ignore it. Celeste looked at him seriously. I'm not naive, Jonah. I know this is going to be difficult, but I also know that Park Ventures needs to evolve, and evolution requires people willing to challenge the status quo. That's you. The rest of the morning was a blur of paperwork, meetings, and introductions to people whose names Jonah immediately forgot. He was assigned an office on the 24th floor, smaller than Celeste's but still larger than his entire apartment, with a view of the city and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. His new assistant, an efficient woman named Patricia, who was probably in her 40s, walked him through the basics of the company's internal systems. You'll want to meet with HR about the retraining program structure, Patricia said, checking her tablet, and legal needs to review the contracts we'll be offering to participants. Ms. Hahn has also scheduled you for a lunch meeting with the heads of our portfolio companies. They need to understand the new labor integration requirements. All of that is today? Welcome to Park Ventures. We don't believe in slow transitions. Patricia smiled, and it was surprisingly warm. For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is important. My brother lost his job when his factory closed 5 years ago. Never really recovered. If someone had offered him what you're offering those men from Hansen, his life might have turned out very differently. It was a reminder that every person in this building had their own story, their own connections to the human cost of corporate decisions. Even here, in this temple of profit and efficiency, real lives were being lived. Jonah spent the afternoon in meetings that tested his patience and his ability to translate his crisis negotiation experience into corporate speak. The HR director wanted detailed metrics for measuring program success. The legal team wanted liability waivers and carefully worded contracts. The portfolio company executives wanted assurances that the retraining program wouldn't disrupt their operations or force them to hire unqualified workers. In every meeting, Jonah felt the underlying resistance. These were people who'd built their careers on certainty, on quantifiable results, on eliminating variables they couldn't control. What he was proposing introduced uncertainty, required them to consider factors that couldn't be easily measured, asked them to care about people they would never meet. But he also saw moments of genuine interest. The HR director, a woman named Susan Chen, who reminded him disturbingly of Detective Chen from the other night, admitted that their current hiring practices often overlooked experienced workers who lacked formal credentials. One of the portfolio executives, a younger man who ran a tech manufacturing company, talked about how hard it was to find skilled workers willing to learn new systems. By 4 p.m., Jonah's brain felt like it had been put through a blender. He made his way down to the childcare center, expecting to find Maya bored or anxious. Instead, she was in the middle of an elaborate construction project with 3 other kids, building something that looked like it might be a castle or possibly a spaceship. "Dad!" She ran over, face flushed with excitement. "Look what we made! And guess what? Tomorrow we're going to add a dragon." "A dragon in a spaceship?" "It's a space castle," one of the other kids explained with the patience of someone talking to a particularly slow adult. Obviously. On the drive home, Maya chattered about her day, about the new friends she'd made, about how the childcare center had better art supplies than her school. Jonah listened, grateful that at least one member of the Carter family had transitioned smoothly into their new life. "Did you have a good day?" Maya asked eventually. "Complicated," Jonah admitted. "Lots of meetings. Lots of people who aren't sure about me yet." Mrs. Chen says people who don't like change are just scared of finding out they've been doing things wrong. Maya looked at him seriously. "Are the people at your work scared?" "Maybe. Yeah, probably." "Then you should help them not be scared. That's what you're good at, remember?" Out of the mouths of babes again. Maybe the entire retraining program should just consist of 7-year-olds explaining basic human decency to corporate executives. That night, after Maya went to bed, Jonah opened his laptop and started drafting the framework for the retraining program. He pulled from his years of crisis negotiation experience, from his understanding of how people responded to trauma and change, from conversations he'd had with workers over the years. The program couldn't just be about job training. It needed to address the psychological impact of job loss, the shame and anger that came from feeling discarded, the fear of being too old or too specialized to start over. He worked until midnight, building something that felt real and substantial, something that might actually help people like Trent and Owen and Rafe and Dominic. Somewhere around 11:30, his phone buzzed with a text from Celeste. "Still working? Go to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be harder." He should have asked how she knew he was still awake. Instead, he just texted back a thumbs up and kept working. The next morning brought the first real test. Jonah arrived at the office to find Richard Brennan had scheduled an executive meeting to discuss concerns about the new Community Relations Division. It was scheduled for 9 a.m., which meant Jonah had exactly 30 minutes to prepare. "He's trying to undermine you before you've even started," Patricia said, bringing him coffee that was probably too expensive to taste as bitter as it did. Classic Richard move. "If I were you, I'd have your numbers ready." "What numbers?" "Any numbers. Richard only respects data. If you walk in there with feelings and good intentions, he'll eat you alive." Jonah spent 25 minutes pulling together every statistic he could find about the costs of labor disputes, the benefits of workforce stability, the long-term value of community relationships. It wasn't enough. He'd need months to build a truly compelling case, but it was something. The executive conference room was on the 26th floor, with an oval table that could seat 20 people and windows that made everything feel like it was happening in the sky. 6 executives were already seated when Jonah arrived. Richard, Susan from HR, the legal director whose name Jonah couldn't remember, and 3 others he hadn't met yet. Celeste walked in 30 seconds after Jonah, taking the seat at the head of the table with the easy confidence of someone who owned the room. "Thank you all for coming. Richard called this meeting to discuss the Community Relations Division. Richard, the floor is yours." Richard stood, which immediately gave him a power advantage Jonah hadn't anticipated. "I want to be clear that my concerns are not personal. Mr. Carter seems like a competent individual. However, creating an entirely new executive division based on a single incident represents exactly the kind of reactive decision-making we should be avoiding. Let's look at the costs." He pulled up a presentation on the large screen at the end of the room. Numbers appeared, projections, budget allocations. The retraining program would cost $4.2 million in the first year. Adding a community relations staff would cost another $3 million. The opportunity cost of executive time spent on labor integration instead of profit optimization was estimated at $2.7 million. "That's nearly $10 million, Richard said. "For what? To prevent situations that may never occur? To make us feel better about hard business decisions? Park Ventures became successful by making rational choices based on data, not emotion. This program is all emotion and no data. Several executives nodded. Jonah felt the room shifting against him before he'd even spoken. "May I?" Jonah asked. Richard sat down with a gesture that suggested Jonah was welcome to embarrass himself. Jonah stood, wishing he'd worn a better suit, wishing he had Richard's easy command of the room, wishing he was anywhere else. But then he thought about Trent's exhausted eyes, about Maya asking if he'd had a good day, about Mrs. Chen saying that hiding made people smaller. "Mr. Brennan's numbers are accurate," Jonah began. "The program will cost approximately $10 million in year one, but let's talk about what we're actually buying with that money. 3 years ago, when Park Ventures divested from Hanson Manufacturing, how much did the company spend on security after workers began protesting outside this building?" Silence. "I'll tell you, $750,000 on increased security, another $200,000 on legal fees related to harassment claims, and approximately $1.3 million in lost productivity when executives had to deal with constant disruptions. That's $2.25 million spent managing a crisis that could have been prevented. And that's just one divestment." He pulled up his own hastily assembled data on his tablet. "In the past 5 years, Park Ventures has divested from or significantly restructured 7 companies. Each one resulted in some level of labor conflict. Each conflict costs money, sometimes in direct costs like security and legal fees, sometimes in indirect costs like damaged reputation and difficulty attracting future investments. The total cost of managing these conflicts exceeds $14 million. Richard leaned forward. "You're comparing actual costs to hypothetical savings. I'm comparing the cost of prevention to the cost of crisis management, and I'm suggesting that investing in relationships before they break is cheaper than repairing them afterward." Jonah looked around the table. Every person in this room has spent their career optimizing for efficiency. But human beings aren't efficient. We're messy and emotional, and we do irrational things when we feel threatened or discarded. The Community Relations Division isn't about feelings, it's about risk management. One of the executives Jonah hadn't met spoke up, an older woman with white hair and sharp eyes. "What's your metric for success? How do we know if this program is working?" It was a fair question, Jonah thought carefully before answering. "Short term, we measure participation rates in the retraining program, job placement success, and reduction in labor conflicts across our portfolio. Long term, we measure employee satisfaction in companies where we've invested, community perception of Park Ventures, and our ability to attract high-quality investment opportunities because we're known as responsible partners." "Those are soft metrics," Richard objected. "Reputation is a soft metric until you try to make a deal and find out the other party won't work with you because they've heard you destroy communities," Jonah countered. "Brand value is a soft metric until a PR crisis tanks your stock price. Worker loyalty is a soft metric until your entire skilled workforce walks out because they don't trust management. Soft metrics become hard losses very quickly when you ignore them." Celeste had been silent throughout the exchange, but now she spoke. "I didn't create this position on impulse. I created it because 4 men walked into a restaurant ready to commit violence against me, and the only thing that prevented tragedy was that a waiter happened to have crisis negotiation experience. That should never have happened. Those men should never have felt so desperate, so invisible, that violence seemed like their only option. The fact that they did represents a failure of Park Ventures to consider human impact in our decision-making." "So this is guilt," Richard said. "This is evolution." Celeste's voice was sharp. "Park Ventures can continue operating the way we always have, maximizing short-term profits and managing crises as they arise. Or we can become the kind of company that prevents crises before they start, that builds lasting relationships with the communities we affect, that proves you can be profitable and responsible simultaneously. I prefer the second option." The room fell silent. Jonah could feel the executives calculating, weighing the costs against the benefits, trying to determine which side of this debate would serve their interests better. Susan from HR broke the silence. "I support the program. We've struggled to find qualified workers for our portfolio companies, and this gives us a pipeline of experienced people who are motivated to prove themselves. It's good business and good ethics." One by one, the other executives offered their positions. 3 supported the program, two remained skeptical, and Richard maintained his opposition. It wasn't unanimous approval, but it was enough. After the meeting ended and the executives filed out, Richard approached Jonah directly. Up close, the CFO looked older, more tired, like he'd spent too many years fighting battles that left no winners. "You're articulate," Richard said. "I'll give you that. But articulation doesn't change reality. This company survives by making hard choices quickly. The moment your soft metrics start costing us real opportunities, this whole division disappears. And so do you." "Then I guess I'd better make sure that doesn't happen," Jonah said. Richard studied him for a long moment. "You really believe in this, don't you? You think you can change how we do business?" "I think I can prevent some people from getting hurt unnecessarily." "That's enough." "It won't be enough for Celeste. She wants you to transform Park Ventures into something it's never been. That's a much bigger ask than stopping a few angry workers from making mistakes." Richard's expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, I hope you succeed. I just don't think you will." He left, and Jonah stood alone in the conference room, looking out at the city below. Somewhere down there, Trent and Owen and Rafe and Dominic were probably going about their days, maybe feeling hopeful for the first time in years. Somewhere down there, other people were standing on their own bridges, one bad day away from making decisions they couldn't take back. And now Jonah was supposed to build something large enough to catch them before they fell. The weight of it should have been crushing. Instead, as he gathered his notes and headed back to his office, Jonah felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt necessary again, and this time he was ready for it. The first 30 days moved faster than Jonah thought possible. He'd expected resistance, bureaucracy, endless meetings that accomplished nothing. What he hadn't expected was how quickly things could move when someone like Celeste Hahn decided they would move. Within a week, the legal framework for the retraining program was finalized. Within 2 weeks, partnerships were established with 3 technical colleges and 2 of Park Ventures' portfolio companies willing to guarantee interviews for program graduates. Within 3 weeks, the first cohort of participants was selected, not just Trent, Owen, Rafe, and Dominic, but 43 other former Hansen manufacturing employees who'd responded to the announcement with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. Jonah spent those 30 days doing everything at once. Designing curriculum with educators who initially looked at him like he was insane for suggesting that psychological support should be as important as technical training. Negotiating with portfolio company executives who wanted guarantees he couldn't give about worker performance. Mediating disputes between HR departments and union representatives who'd spent decades viewing each other as enemies. Conducting intake interviews with program participants who carried their anger and shame like physical weights. And through it all, trying to be present for Maya, who was adapting to their new life with the resilience of children who've learned early that stability is temporary. "Dad, you look tired," Maya said one morning over breakfast. It was a Saturday, 3 weeks into his new job, and Jonah had woken up at his desk after falling asleep reviewing participant files. "Just busy, kiddo." "Busy helping people?" "Trying to." Maya considered this while drowning her pancakes in syrup. "Mrs. Chen says helping people is like planting a garden. You put in all the work at the beginning, but you don't see the flowers for a long time. She says you have to be patient." Mrs. Chen is very wise. She also says you need to eat more vegetables and stop surviving on coffee and stress. Maya looked at him seriously. "I think she's right about that too." Jonah laughed despite his exhaustion. "When did you become the parent in this relationship? Someone has to be responsible." But Maya was smiling, and in that moment, Jonah felt a surge of gratitude that nearly overwhelmed him. His daughter was happy. Actually happy. The small, careful life they'd built was expanding, and instead of being scared, she was thriving. Monday morning brought the official launch of the Worker Transition and Integration Program. Celeste had insisted on a press conference, despite Jonah's objections. "You can't change systems from the shadows," she'd told him. "People need to see that Park Ventures is serious about this." Now Jonah stood backstage in the building's ground floor conference center, listening to the murmur of reporters gathering, fighting the urge to run. Patricia appeared beside him with a tablet and an expression of determined calm. "Celeste speaks first, you speak second, then we take questions for 15 minutes. Simple." "Nothing about this is simple." Then fake it. That's what everyone else in corporate America does. Patricia adjusted his tie, which he'd put on wrong. For what it's worth, the program is solid. The participants I've spoken with are genuinely grateful. You've built something real, Jonah. Don't let stage fright keep you from showing people what's possible. Celeste emerged from somewhere, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than Jonah's first car, and an expression of absolute confidence. Ready? No. Good. The best speeches come from people who are scared. Means you care about getting it right. She glanced at her watch. We're on in 2 minutes. Just remember, you're not selling something you don't believe in. You're explaining something you know is important. There's a difference. The stage lights were harsh and disorienting. Jonah stood slightly behind and to the left of the podium, while Celeste addressed the assembled media. She spoke about Park Ventures' commitment to responsible investment, about the need for corporations to consider their impact on workers and communities, about the worker transition program as a model for how private equity could create value while maintaining human dignity. It was a good speech, polished and strategic, hitting all the right notes. But Jonah wondered how many people in the room actually believed it, versus how many saw it as clever PR designed to rehabilitate Park Ventures' reputation. Then Celeste was introducing him, and he was walking to the podium, facing cameras and reporters, and the weight of expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. 3 weeks ago, I was a waiter, Jonah began, abandoning the prepared remarks Patricia had written. I'd spent 3 years serving food to people who rarely looked at me. And that's exactly how I wanted it. I was invisible, safe, and convinced I'd left behind the part of my life where I tried to help people in crisis. He saw Celeste tense slightly. This wasn't the corporate message she'd wanted, but he continued anyway. Then 4 men walked into the restaurant where I worked. They were angry, desperate, and armed. They were there to confront Ms. Hahn about a decision her company had made 3 years earlier, a decision that had destroyed their lives. And I had a choice. I could stay invisible, let the situation play out however it would, protect myself. Or I could step forward and try to help. Jonah looked directly at the cameras. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound heroic. I'm telling you this because those 4 men, Trent, Owen, Rafe, and Dominic, represent thousands of workers who've been displaced by corporate decisions. Good people who spent decades building skills, supporting families, contributing to their communities. People who did everything right and still lost everything because market conditions changed or profit margins weren't sufficient or a private equity firm decided their factory wasn't worth the investment. He could feel the room's attention sharpening, reporters leaning forward, cameras focusing. The worker transition program isn't charity. It's not even primarily about helping people, though it does that. It's about recognizing that when corporations make decisions that affect workers' lives, those workers are stakeholders too. They deserve more than a severance check and a wish for good luck. They deserve pathways to new opportunities, support during transitions, and most importantly, they deserve to be seen as human beings rather than line items on a balance sheet. A reporter in the front row raised her hand. Mr. Carter, isn't this just an expensive way for Park Ventures to buy good publicity after years of criticism about their labor practices? Probably, Jonah admitted, and he heard Celeste's sharp intake of breath beside him. Ms. Hahn would tell you it's good business and good ethics working together. I tell you I don't particularly care about the motivation as long as the outcome helps people. Judge us by our results, not our press releases. The questions came rapid fire after that. How many participants? What's the success rate? Why should other companies follow this model? How do you respond to critics who say this proves Park Ventures' previous decisions were wrong? Jonah answered as honestly as he could, admitting when he didn't know something, refusing to make promises he couldn't keep, focusing on the human stories rather than corporate messaging. It was probably everything Patricia and Celeste didn't want him to do. But it felt right. Afterward, backstage, Celeste was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "That was either brilliant or a complete disaster. I'm not sure which yet. I'm sorry if I went off script. Don't apologize. You gave them something real instead of something polished. That's actually harder to dismiss." She pulled out her phone, which was already buzzing with messages. "Though you're going to give Richard a heart attack when he sees the headlines." Richard's heart attack came approximately 3 hours later when he stormed into Jonah's office holding a tablet displaying the news coverage. "Park Ventures admits past mistakes in emotional press conference," he read. New VP questions company's motivations for worker program. Do you have any idea what you've done? I told the truth, Jonah said calmly. The truth? The truth is that you've given every critic of this company ammunition to use against us. You've made us look weak, uncertain, guilty. Or I've made us look honest for the first time in years. Richard threw the tablet onto Jonah's desk hard enough to make the pens rattle. You don't understand how this world works. Corporations don't admit mistakes. They project confidence, they control the narrative, they never ever give the appearance of doubt. Maybe that's the problem. Jonah stood up, meeting Richard's glare. Maybe if corporations occasionally admitted when they got things wrong, people wouldn't be so angry at them. Maybe if companies like Park Ventures treated workers like stakeholders, instead of problems to be managed, we wouldn't have situations where desperate men show up with weapons. That happened once. One time. And now you're using it to justify turning this company into some kind of social welfare program. I'm using it to build something that prevents it from happening again. Jonah's voice stayed level, but he could feel anger building beneath the calm. You know what I did before I became a waiter, Richard? I talked people off ledges, literally and figuratively. I spent 8 years in crisis negotiation, and I learned something important. By the time someone is standing on a bridge ready to jump, you've already failed them. The real work is identifying people in crisis before they reach that point, before they're so desperate that violence or suicide seems like the only option. And you think a training program does that? I think acknowledging people's humanity before you destroy their livelihoods does that. I think having conversations with workers before announcing layoffs does that. I think treating people like they matter does that. Jonah sat back down. But you're right about one thing. I don't understand how this world works. I understand how people work. And maybe that's exactly why Celeste hired me. Richard was quiet for a moment, his anger seeming to deflate into something more like exhaustion. You really believe you can change things? I believe I can help some people. That's enough. It won't be enough for the board. It won't be enough for our investors. And eventually, it won't be enough for Celeste. Richard moved toward the door, then paused. You want to know the real reason I oppose this program? It's not because I don't care about workers. It's because I've seen what happens when companies try to be everything to everyone. They lose focus, they make emotional decisions, and they fail. And when they fail, everyone suffers. Workers, investors, communities, everyone. Sometimes the hard choice is actually the right choice, even when it hurts people. After Richard left, Jonah sat in his office and stared at the city below. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe trying to balance profit with human dignity was impossible. Maybe he was naive to think one program could change how an entire company operated. His phone buzzed. A text from Trent Holloway. Saw you on the news. Took guts to say what you said. First day of training starts tomorrow. 43 of us showed up for orientation. 43 people who thought we were done, who thought nobody cared. You gave us a chance to matter again. Whatever happens with the program, I want you to know that. Then another text, this one from Owen. My wife called. First time in 6 months. She saw the news about the program, asked if I was really getting a second chance. I told her maybe. She said maybe she'd like to get coffee sometime, talk about whether we could have a second chance too. Thank you for that. The messages kept coming throughout the day. Rafe sent a photo of his daughter's acceptance letter to return to college, the financial aid package supplemented by the program's support stipend. Dominic sent a simple message. I slept through the night for the first time in 2 years. Didn't know I could still do that. These were the metrics that mattered, Jonah thought. Not quarterly earnings or stock prices or favorable press coverage, but real people finding hope in situations that had seemed hopeless. Richard could call it soft metrics all he wanted. To Jonah, it was the hardest, most essential measurement of success possible. The weeks that followed established a rhythm. Monday mornings were for program check-ins, meeting with participants to address problems and celebrate progress. Tuesday afternoons were for portfolio company visits, building relationships with executives and floor managers who would eventually hire program graduates. Wednesdays were reserved for crisis prevention, analyzing Park Ventures' upcoming investments for potential labor issues, developing communication strategies, creating frameworks for worker engagement before decisions were announced. Thursdays were the hardest. Those were the days Jonah mediated actual conflicts, situations where workers and management had already reached impasse. A manufacturing plant in Ohio where the workforce was threatening to strike over safety conditions. A tech company in Seattle where mass layoffs were planned without any transition support. A distribution center in Nevada where workers claimed management was retaliating against union organizers. Each situation required Jonah to be translator, mediator, and occasionally referee between parties who spoke different languages and operated from incompatible assumptions about how the world worked. Management wanted efficiency and compliance. Workers wanted dignity and fair treatment. Finding the overlap required patience Jonah sometimes wasn't sure he possessed. But slowly, impossibly, it started working. The Ohio plant implemented new safety protocols after Jonah facilitated a series of meetings where workers could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. The Seattle tech company agreed to a voluntary separation program with enhanced benefits instead of sudden layoffs. The Nevada distribution center established a formal grievance process that both union organizers and management could accept. Not every situation resolved cleanly. Some conflicts were too entrenched, some positions too far apart. Jonah learned to accept that success didn't mean fixing everything. It meant preventing things from getting worse, creating space for dialogue where only hostility had existed before. Maya noticed the change in him. "You smile more now," she observed one night while they were making dinner together. Actually, making dinner, not just heating up frozen food because Jonah was too exhausted to cook. "Do I?" "Yeah, it's different than before. Before you smiled because you were supposed to. Now you smile because you mean it." Jonah pulled her into a hug, struck again by his daughter's ability to see through his defenses. "I think I'm finding my way back to who I used to be, before everything got complicated." "Or maybe you're finding who you're supposed to become," Maya said. "That's different." 2 months into the program, Celeste called Jonah into her office at 6 p.m. on a Friday. He'd learned that late Friday meetings usually meant either very good news or very bad news, with no middle ground. "We need to talk about Sarah Martinez," Celeste said without preamble. Jonah felt his stomach drop. "What about her?" "A reporter contacted our PR department. She's working on a profile of you, and she found the Sarah Martinez case. She wants to know how a crisis negotiator who failed to save a suicidal woman ended up running a worker welfare program for a private equity firm." Celeste's expression was unreadable. "She's going to publish the story regardless of whether you cooperate. But she's giving us the opportunity to provide your side." "There is no my side. I failed. Sarah died. That's the story." "That's not the whole story." Celeste pulled up something on her tablet. "I had our research team look into the Sarah Martinez case. Did you know she'd attempted suicide twice before? Did you know she'd been involuntarily committed 3 times in the previous year? Did you know that the bridge she climbed onto had inadequate safety barriers that the city had been warned about for months? None of that changes the fact that I didn't save her." "No, but it changes the narrative from incompetent negotiator kills woman to overwhelmed system fails vulnerable person despite heroic efforts. You talked to her for 4 hours, Jonah. 4 hours. Most negotiators would have given up after 1. You stayed with her, kept her talking, almost brought her back. And then a random truck backfired at exactly the wrong moment, and she fell. That's not failure, that's tragedy." Jonah looked away, out at the city lights that had become familiar over the past months. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but reframing my failure doesn't make it less real. I was supposed to save her. I didn't. I'll carry that for the rest of my life." "I know. But maybe it's time to stop letting that one moment define your entire existence." Celeste stood up and moved to stand beside him at the window. "You've helped dozens of people in the past 2 months, prevented multiple crises, built something meaningful. At some point, you have to decide whether Sarah Martinez's death means you can never help anyone again, or whether it means you understand the stakes better than most people ever will." "The reporter," Jonah said. "What does she want?" "An interview, on camera, about Sarah, about the program, about your journey from crisis negotiator to waiter to VP of Community Relations." Celeste paused. "I think you should do it." "Absolutely not." "Jonah, I said no. My past is my business. The program stands on its own merits. It doesn't need my sob story to legitimize it. Celeste sighed. You're wrong, but I can't force you. Just think about it. The reporter's deadline is next Friday. You have a week to change your mind. That weekend, Jonah tried not to think about Sarah Martinez, which meant he thought about nothing else. He took Maya to the park, helped her with homework, made elaborate meals he barely tasted. The memories he'd worked so hard to bury kept surfacing. Sarah's voice, her desperate explanation of why life had become unbearable, the exact expression on her face in the split second before she fell. On Sunday afternoon, Mrs. Chen knocked on his door with a casserole and a knowing look. You're brooding. I'm thinking. Same thing, in your case. She handed him the casserole and invited herself in. Maya's in my apartment watching a movie. We have an hour. Talk. So Jonah talked. He told her about the reporter, about Celeste's suggestion that he do the interview, about his certainty that revisiting Sarah Martinez publicly would destroy whatever fragile peace he'd managed to build. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, which was unlike her. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. My husband died 15 years ago, she said finally. Heart attack. He was in the garden, planting tomatoes, and just collapsed. I was inside making lunch. By the time I found him, it was too late. Her voice was matter of fact, but her hands trembled slightly. For years, I couldn't go into the garden. Couldn't plant anything. The sight of tomatoes in the grocery store made me cry. I let that garden turn into a wasteland because I couldn't face it. What changed? My granddaughter came to visit. She was 6, about Maya's age. She looked at that dead garden and asked why we didn't grow things. And I realized I had a choice. I could keep letting my husband's death define that space, or I could honor his memory by making it beautiful again. Mrs. Chen met his eyes. The garden didn't bring him back, but tending it helped me remember that life continues, that growth is possible even after terrible loss. Sarah Martinez is in a garden. No, but the lesson is the same. You can let her death be the end of your story, or you can let it be the reason your story continues, the reason you understand why this work matters. After Mrs. Chen left, Jonah sat on his couch and pulled out his phone. He'd saved one article about Sarah Martinez, the only one he could bear to look at. It was from a small community blog, written by Sarah's friend. It talked about her art, her kindness, her struggles with mental illness, her determination to get better. It talked about how she'd helped other people in her support group, how she'd volunteered at an animal shelter, how she'd made people laugh even when she was barely holding herself together. The article ended with a quote from Sarah's mother. My daughter was more than her worst moment. I hope people remember that. Jonah had read those words dozens of times, always hearing them as an accusation. But maybe they weren't. Maybe Sarah's mother was simply asking the world to see her daughter completely, to understand that one tragic moment didn't erase years of beauty and struggle and hope. Maybe he needed to extend the same grace to himself. On Monday morning, Jonah walked into Celeste's office before she'd even finished her first coffee. I'll do the interview, he said. But on my terms. I talk about Sarah, about what happened, about what I learned, and then I talk about why that makes me better at this job, not worse. Why understanding failure is essential to preventing it. Celeste smiled. I'll call the reporter. The interview was scheduled for Thursday afternoon in a conference room that had been converted into a makeshift studio. The reporter was younger than Jonah expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of focused intelligence that suggested she'd already done significant research. Thank you for agreeing to this, she said as her camera operator set up equipment. I know this can't be easy. It's not, but I think it's important. Jonah settled into his chair, acutely aware of the camera's presence. What do you want to know? Start with Sarah Martinez. Tell me what happened that day. So Jonah told the story. Not the sanitized version he'd given to investigators, not the defensive version he'd used to protect himself from blame, but the truth. He talked about connecting with Sarah, about feeling like he was getting through to her, about the hope that had been building that they might actually bring her home safely. He talked about the truck backfiring, about reaching for her too slowly, about the moment when hope transformed into horror. I've replayed that moment 10,000 times, Jonah said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath it. If I'd been 6 inches closer, if I'd reacted a tenth of a second faster, if I'd said something different in the minute before. There are infinite ways I could have saved her, and I found none of them. But you did everything you were trained to do, the reporter said gently. Training isn't enough when someone dies. Everyone told me I wasn't responsible, that I'd done my best, that sometimes people can't be saved. And intellectually I understood that. But emotionally, I couldn't accept it. So I quit. Became invisible. Spent 3 years serving food to people who didn't see me because being unseen felt safer than being responsible for another person's life. What changed? Jonah thought about that night at Lumiere, about 4 desperate men and 1 billionaire CEO, and a choice that had seemed both impossible and inevitable. I remembered that hiding from failure doesn't prevent it. It just means you're not there to help when someone else needs you. He looked directly at the camera. Sarah Martinez taught me that the stakes of this work are real, that people's lives hang in the balance, that good intentions aren't enough. And that's exactly why the worker transition program matters. Because I've seen what happens when people feel invisible, when they believe nobody cares whether they succeed or fail. They make desperate choices, and sometimes those choices can't be undone. The interview continued for another hour. Jonah talked about the program, about the participants who were rebuilding their lives, about the philosophy that had guided his work. He was honest about the challenges, about the executives who still saw workers as problems rather than people, about his own doubts that any of this would create lasting change. But he was also honest about hope, about Trent sleeping through the night, about Owen reconciling with his wife, about Rafe's daughter returning to college, about all the small victories that added up to something larger than any individual success. When it was over, the reporter turned off her camera and smiled. That was powerful. Thank you for being so open. When does it air? Next week? Tuesday evening? Primetime slot? She packed up her equipment. For what it's worth, I think what you're building is important, and I think Sarah Martinez would be proud of how you're using what you learned from her. Jonah wasn't sure about that, but maybe Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe the best way to honor someone's death was to let it inform how you lived. The story aired on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, Jonah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some calls were supportive, former colleagues from the police department, program participants, people who'd lost loved ones to suicide and found meaning in his honesty about failure. Other calls were critical, people who thought he'd abandoned his duty when he quit the force, people who saw the worker transition program as corporate propaganda, people who simply wanted someone to blame for their own frustrations. But the call that mattered most came from a number he didn't recognize, at 8 p.m. on Wednesday night. Mr. Carter? This is Elena Martinez, Sarah's mother. Jonah's breath caught. Ms. Martinez, I saw your interview. I wanted to thank you. Thank me? Jonah couldn't process that. Ms. Martinez, I failed to save your daughter. I don't deserve... You spent 4 hours trying to bring my baby back to me. 4 hours talking to her, listening to her, making her feel seen. Elena's voice broke slightly. After she died, I was so angry. I needed someone to blame, and you were there. But watching you talk about Sarah, seeing how much her death still hurts you, how it changed your whole life, I realized you loved her too, in that moment. You cared about saving her, about making her believe life was worth living, and that matters. Tears were streaming down Jonah's face. I'm so sorry I couldn't. I know. I'm sorry too. Sorry I screamed at you. Sorry I blamed you. Sorry I couldn't see that you were hurting as much as I was. Elena took a shaky breath. My daughter struggled for years. She tried so hard to get better, to find reasons to stay. And on her last day, you gave her 4 more hours. 4 more hours where someone cared, where she wasn't alone. That's not nothing, Mr. Carter. That's everything you could have given her. After they hung up, Jonah sat in the darkness of his living room and cried harder than he had since the day Sarah died. Not because the guilt was gone, it would never be fully gone, but because for the first time he could see past it to something else, to the possibility that he'd done his best, to the understanding that some people carried burdens too heavy for any one person to lift, to the grace of knowing that Sarah's mother had found a way to forgive him. Maybe that meant he could start forgiving himself. The call from Elena Martinez changed something fundamental in Jonah. Not overnight. Healing never worked that way, but gradually, like ice melting under steady sunlight. He'd carried Sarah's death as proof of his unworthiness, evidence that he shouldn't be trusted with responsibility for other people's lives. But Elena's forgiveness suggested a different interpretation. Maybe his failure had taught him something essential. Maybe understanding how easily things could go wrong made him better at preventing disasters, not worse. The interview's impact rippled outward in ways Jonah hadn't anticipated. Applications for the worker transition program tripled within a week. Other private equity firms contacted Park Ventures asking about the model, whether it could be replicated, what the actual costs versus benefits looked like. 3 universities requested permission to study the program as a case example of corporate social responsibility. Even Richard Brennan, who'd opposed the initiative from the beginning, admitted in a tense executive meeting that the positive press had increased Park Ventures' valuation by 2%. "I still think you're naive," Richard told Jonah after that meeting, "but I'm starting to think maybe the world needs more naive people willing to try impossible things." Coming from Richard, it was practically a declaration of love. But the real test came 3 months after the program launched, when Celeste called Jonah into her office on a Monday morning with an expression that suggested either disaster or opportunity, possibly both. "We have a problem," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "Or maybe an opportunity disguised as a problem. I can't decide which." "What happened?" "Park Ventures is considering a major investment in Meridian Steel, a manufacturing company with plants in 3 states and roughly 2,000 employees. The company is profitable but inefficient. Our analysts project we could increase margins by 15% through restructuring, which would involve closing 2 of the 3 plants and consolidating operations." Jonah felt his stomach tighten. "How many jobs lost?" "Approximately 1,300. Most of them in towns where Meridian is the primary employer." Celeste pulled up a map showing the plant locations, small towns in Pennsylvania and Indiana, the kind of places that had been hollowing out for decades as manufacturing moved overseas or automated. "This is exactly the situation you were hired to handle. The board wants your assessment before we proceed." "My assessment is that destroying 1,300 jobs in 2 communities isn't worth a 15% margin increase." "I expected you'd say that, but it's not that simple." Celeste brought up financial projections. "If we don't invest, Meridian will likely fail within 2 years anyway. They're undercapitalized and losing market share. At least our investment gives them a chance to survive. And the consolidated plant would retain 700 jobs. Sometimes the choice isn't between good and bad, it's between bad and worse." Jonah studied the data, his mind racing through scenarios. This was the nightmare situation he'd been dreading, where the math clearly pointed one direction and his conscience pointed another. "Give me a week. Let me visit the plants, talk to the workers and management, see if there's a third option nobody's considered yet." "You have 3 days. The board votes Friday morning." Jonah spent Tuesday traveling to Pennsylvania, to a town called Millbrook that existed almost entirely to support the Meridian Steel plant. Population 3,800, median income 32,000, Main Street lined with boarded-up shops and empty storefronts. The plant itself was massive and outdated, equipment that should have been replaced a decade ago still grinding away, producing steel components for manufacturers who were increasingly sourcing cheaper alternatives overseas. He met with the plant manager, a man named Frank Delgado, who'd worked at Meridian for 33 years and looked like he'd aged twice that much. Frank gave Jonah a tour of the facility, pointing out the inefficiencies that made the plant vulnerable. Energy costs were too high, production speed too slow, quality control too inconsistent. "I know we're not competitive," Frank admitted as they stood on the factory floor surrounded by the deafening noise of machinery. "I've been telling corporate for years we need to modernize, but they never want to spend the money. Now it's probably too late." "What happens to this town if the plant closes?" Frank looked out at his workers, men and women who'd spent careers at these machines, building expertise that wouldn't transfer to any other industry. "Millbrook dies. Simple as that. Some people will move, looking for work elsewhere. Most can't afford to. They'll stay here, collecting whatever unemployment they can get, watching their town rot. I've seen it happen to a dozen places just like this." Jonah spent the afternoon interviewing workers. A woman named Maria who'd worked assembly for 18 years, supporting 3 kids on her salary. A young man named Deshaun who'd just completed an apprenticeship program. finally earning enough to move out of his mother's house. An older worker named Bill, who was 2 years from retirement, his pension dependent on the company remaining solvent. Every conversation was a variation on the same theme. These were people who'd done everything right, worked hard, learned skills, stayed loyal to a company that was now failing despite their efforts. They knew the plant was struggling. They knew closure was possible. But knowing something intellectually was different from accepting its reality. Wednesday, Jonah flew to Indiana to visit the second plant scheduled for closure. The story was the same, but somehow worse. A smaller town, older equipment, workers who'd already watched neighboring communities collapse and knew exactly what their future held. That night, in a hotel room that smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation, Jonah called Celeste. "There has to be another way," he said. "I'm listening." "What if we don't close the plants? What if we invest in modernization instead? Update the equipment, improve efficiency, keep the jobs?" "That would cost $47 million more than our restructuring plan, with a longer timeline to profitability and higher risk." Celeste's voice was patient but firm. "Jonah, I understand what you're feeling. I've walked through dying towns and seen the human cost. But we can't save every struggling company. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let them fail quickly rather than prolonging the inevitable." Kindest for who? Not for the 1,300 people who lose their jobs. Not for the communities that collapse. Jonah ran his hand through his hair, exhaustion making him less diplomatic than usual. "You hired me to find solutions that don't sacrifice people for profit. Let me do that. You have until tomorrow afternoon. After that, I have to present something to the board." Jonah didn't sleep. Instead, he spent the night researching, making calls, building a proposal that was probably insane but might be just crazy enough to work. He called in favors from people he'd worked with during crisis negotiations, contacted union representatives, reached out to local government officials. By sunrise, he had the skeleton of an idea. By noon, he had enough to present. He flew back Wednesday afternoon and walked into Celeste's office with a 30-page proposal that represented the most ambitious thing he'd ever attempted. "Here's the third option," Jonah said, dropping the document on her desk. "We invest in Meridian, but not through traditional restructuring. We create a worker cooperative model. Park Ventures provides the capital for modernization, $47 million, like you said, but instead of owning the company outright, we partner with the workers. They gain equity stake through profit sharing. They have representation on the board. They have a voice in major decisions." Celeste flipped through the proposal, her expression unreadable. "This is unprecedented for Park Ventures. So is creating a worker transition program. So is hiring a former waiter as a VP. You've built a career on unprecedented decisions." Jonah leaned forward. "Here's the business case. Worker-owned companies have higher productivity, lower turnover, better quality control. Employees with ownership stake care more about outcomes. Plus, the PR value is enormous. Park Ventures becomes the firm that empowers workers instead of displacing them. That's worth more than a 15% margin increase. It's also riskier. If the cooperative fails, we lose $47 million. If we close the plants, we lose 2 communities and 1,300 workers who could have been allies become enemies. That's risk too, just harder to quantify." Jonah pulled out his final piece of evidence: letters from the Millbrook and Indiana mayors, from union representatives, from workers themselves, all pledging support for the cooperative model. "I've already done preliminary outreach. People are willing to try this. They want to fight for their jobs, their communities. We just have to give them the tools." Celeste was quiet for a long time, reading through the proposal, checking the financial projections, weighing risks against potential rewards. Finally, she looked up. "This could destroy both of us if it fails. The board will think we've lost our minds. Richard will have ammunition for months. Every decision we make will be questioned." "I know. But it might also be the most important thing Park Ventures has ever done." She closed the folder. "I'll present it to the board tomorrow. No promises." The board meeting Friday morning was brutal. Jonah presented his proposal to 12 executives and board members who looked at him with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. Richard led the opposition, dismantling the financial projections, questioning the feasibility of worker cooperation, pointing out every way the plan could fail. "This is social engineering, not business," Richard argued. We're an investment firm, not a charity. Our responsibility is to our shareholders, not to every struggling worker in America. Our responsibility is to make smart investments, Jonah countered. Worker cooperatives aren't charity. They're proven business models with success rates comparable to traditional structures. What I'm proposing is smart risk management, investing in people who have the most to lose and therefore the most motivation to succeed. And when it fails, one board member asked, when these workers can't manage a complex business and the company collapses anyway? Then we'll have at least tried something different. We'll have learned what works and what doesn't. And we'll have 1,300 people who know that someone gave them a chance instead of just writing them off. Jonah looked around the table. I'm not naive. I know this is risky, but I also know that the old model, extract profit, discard people, move on, is creating a society of desperate, angry individuals who feel invisible. Eventually, that desperation explodes. I've seen it. I've lived it. And I'm telling you, preventing that explosion is worth $47 million. The vote was close. 7 in favor, 5 opposed. Celeste cast the deciding vote, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. Park Ventures will invest in Meridian Steel as a worker cooperative. Mr. Carter will oversee the implementation. We'll revisit the decision in 18 months based on performance metrics. She looked directly at Richard. And if it fails, I take full responsibility. After the meeting, Richard approached Jonah in the hallway. You have 18 months to prove this works. If Meridian fails, this whole social responsibility experiment dies with it. No more worker transition program, no more community relations division. Everything you've built disappears. Understood. Good. Richard started to walk away, then paused. For what it's worth, I hope you succeed. Not because I believe in your philosophy, but because I'm tired of being the villain in your story. Maybe it's time for a different narrative. The transformation of Meridian Steel into a worker cooperative took 6 months of intense negotiation, legal restructuring, and cultural change management. Jonah practically lived in Millbrook in Indiana, working with employees to establish governance structures, helping them understand financial statements, mediating disputes about equity distribution and decision-making authority. It was exhausting, frustrating, and occasionally seemed impossible. Workers who'd spent careers taking orders had to learn to make strategic decisions. Management had to learn to share power with people they'd previously just directed. Union representatives and executives had to find common language after decades of adversarial relationships. But slowly, impossibly, it started working. The modernized equipment arrived. Production efficiency improved. Workers with ownership stakes showed up differently, more engaged, more innovative, more willing to solve problems instead of just identifying them. Quality control issues decreased as workers took personal pride in products that now partially belonged to them. Maya noticed the change in her father during this period. He was busy, often exhausted, but there was a lightness to him that hadn't existed before. You're different now, she said one Saturday morning over their traditional pancakes. She was 8 now, growing taller and more perceptive every day. Different how? You used to carry sadness like it was your job. Now you carry hope instead. It looks better on you. Jonah smiled at his daughter, this wise, small person who'd somehow learned to see through all his defenses. I'm learning that helping people is more complicated than I thought, but also more possible. Mrs. Chen says you're finally becoming yourself again. She says the person you were before was good, but the person you're becoming is better. Mrs. Chen has a lot of opinions. That's because she's usually right, Maya grinned. Also, she wants to know if Ms. Han is going to be part of our family. Jonah nearly dropped his coffee. What? Why would she think that? Because you talk about her all the time, and you smile when her name comes up. And last week when she called during dinner, you left the table for 45 minutes and came back looking happy. Maya shrugged. Mrs. Chen says you're both workaholics who use business as an excuse not to admit you care about each other. Out of the mouths of extremely perceptive babes. The truth was, Jonah's relationship with Celeste had evolved over the months into something he couldn't quite categorize. They worked together constantly, shared victories and frustrations, challenged each other's assumptions. She'd seen him at his most vulnerable, talking about Sarah Martinez, doubting his abilities, struggling with decisions that had no good answers. He'd seen past her Ice Queen exterior to the person underneath, someone who carried her own guilt, her own doubts, her own desperate hope that wealth and power could somehow be used responsibly. Whether that added up to romance, Jonah wasn't sure, but it definitely added up to something. The 18-month evaluation of Meridian Steel came on a Tuesday in early June. The board meeting was tense, everyone aware that the company's entire social responsibility initiative hung on the results. Jonah presented the data with Patricia's help. Production efficiency up 23%, quality defects down 18%, worker retention at 97%, and most importantly, profitability restored with projections for sustained growth. Meridian Steel is now profitable and sustainable, Jonah concluded. The worker cooperative model succeeded beyond our initial projections. Employees with ownership stake proved to be more productive, more innovative, and more committed to the company's success than traditional labor models. This isn't just good ethics, it's good business. Richard stood up, and Jonah braced himself for criticism. Instead, Richard said, "I was wrong. I opposed this initiative at every step, convinced it would fail. But the data is undeniable. Mr. Carter's approach worked. More than that, it worked better than our traditional restructuring model would have. I'm prepared to support expanding this model to other Park Ventures investments." The room erupted in conversation. Several board members who'd been skeptical now wanted to explore cooperative models for other struggling companies. Suddenly, Jonah's experimental program had become Park Ventures' signature innovation. After the meeting, Celeste found Jonah standing at his office window, looking out at the city that had become familiar over the past year and a half. "You did it," she said simply. "We did it. I couldn't have done any of this without you backing me. I provided support. You provided vision." Celeste moved to stand beside him. "I have a question, and I need you to be honest." "Okay. Are you happy? Really happy? Or are you still running from something?" Jonah considered the question seriously. Was he happy? He had meaningful work, financial security, respect from colleagues who doubted him. He was helping people, preventing crises, building systems that actually functioned. Maya was thriving. He slept through most nights without nightmares about Sarah Martinez. "I'm not running anymore," he said finally. "I'm not sure I've completely arrived at wherever I'm going, but I'm definitely moving forward instead of hiding." "Good. Because I have another proposition for you. The last time you said that, you offered me a job that changed my life. This one might change it again." Celeste pulled out her tablet, showing him something she'd been working on. "I want to create a foundation, separate from Park Ventures but funded by our profits. Its mission would be promoting worker-owned enterprises, providing capital and support for companies transitioning to cooperative models, training programs for workers learning to manage businesses. And I want you to run it." Jonah stared at the proposal. It was ambitious, almost absurdly so. It would mean leaving Park Ventures, starting something entirely new, taking risks that made the Meridian Steel project look cautious by comparison. It was also exactly what the world needed. Why me? Because you understand something most people in this industry don't, that businesses are made of people, that people matter more than spreadsheets, that preventing human tragedy is worth the investment even when the returns aren't immediately quantifiable. Celeste met his eyes. "Also because I trust you, and trust is the rarest commodity in this world. I need to think about it, talk to Maya, figure out what this means for our life." "Take your time. But Jonah?" Celeste smiled, and it transformed her face into something warm and open. "You've already changed Park Ventures. Now you have the chance to change the whole system. Don't let fear stop you from taking it." That night, Jonah sat down with Maya and explained the opportunity, trying to make it simple enough for an 8-year-old to understand while respecting her intelligence enough not to talk down to her. "So you'd be helping even more people?" Maya asked when he finished. "That's the idea. But it would mean even longer hours sometimes, more travel, more uncertainty about whether it will work." Maya looked at him with those serious eyes that were so much like her mother's. "Dad, do you remember when you were a waiter and I asked if you were happy?" "I remember." "You said you were fine, but fine isn't the same as happy." She reached across the table to take his hand. "Now when I ask if you're happy, you actually have to think about it. That's better." And if helping more people makes you think even harder about being happy, then you should do it. Just like that? Just like that. Also, Mrs. Chen says that when you find the thing you're supposed to do with your life, you feel it in your bones. She says you found it, and now you're just scared of admitting it. Jonah laughed despite himself. Mrs. Chen really needs to stop having so many opinions about my life. She wouldn't have to if you'd figure things out faster. Maya grinned. So are you going to do it? I think I am. Yeah. Good. Now can we have ice cream to celebrate? The foundation launched 3 months later. Jonah spent those months wrapping up his work at Park Ventures, training his replacement, saying goodbye to colleagues who'd become friends. Patricia cried when he told her he was leaving, then immediately asked if the foundation needed an executive assistant. I've spent 20 years working for people who saw employees as resources to be managed, Patricia said. I'd like to spend the next 20 working for someone who sees them as humans to be supported. Richard gave Jonah an awkward handshake and an even more awkward compliment. You made me reconsider assumptions I've held for 30 years. That's not comfortable, but it's necessary. Good luck with the foundation. Try not to bankrupt yourself being too idealistic. Celeste's goodbye was private, in her office after hours when the building was mostly empty. They'd worked so closely for so long that the prospect of not seeing each other daily felt strange, almost painful. I'm going to miss fighting with you about whether people matter more than profit margins, Celeste said. You're going to miss losing those fights, you mean? I never lost. I just occasionally reconsidered my position. She smiled. What happens now? I build the foundation. You continue evolving Park Ventures. We change the world from different angles. That's the professional answer. I meant personally. Jonah looked at this woman who'd seen him at his lowest and believed in him anyway, who'd risked her company's reputation on his untested ideas, who'd become someone he couldn't imagine his life without. Honestly, I don't know. I spent 3 years hiding from connection because I was afraid of failing people. Now I'm finally learning that connection is worth the risk. He stepped closer. So maybe we figure it out together, slowly, without any grand plans or certainty about where it's going. I can work with that. Celeste closed the distance between them, and when she kissed him, it felt like the final piece of something clicking into place. The foundation's first project was supporting 3 manufacturing plants in the Midwest transitioning to worker cooperatives. Jonah threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd brought to crisis negotiation years ago, but now without the crushing weight of believing every failure would destroy him. He learned to accept that some projects would succeed while others struggled, that helping people was messy and complicated and couldn't always be measured in neat metrics. 6 months after the foundation launched, Jonah received an invitation to speak at a national conference on worker ownership. He almost declined. Public speaking still made him uncomfortable. Visibility still felt dangerous. But Maya talked him into it. You have to tell people what you learned, she insisted. Otherwise, they'll keep making the same mistakes and nobody will know there's a better way. So Jonah stood on a stage in front of 300 people and told his story. Not just the triumphant parts, the successful programs, the lives changed, the community saved, but the failures too. He talked about Sarah Martinez, about how her death had nearly destroyed him, but ultimately taught him something essential about the stakes of their work. He talked about the projects that hadn't succeeded, the workers he couldn't help, the situations where the cooperative model failed despite everyone's best efforts. The point isn't that we can save everyone, Jonah concluded. The point is that we have to try, because the alternative, accepting that some people are expendable, that profit matters more than dignity, that the best we can do is manage casualties. That alternative creates the kind of world where desperate people make desperate choices. And I've spent enough time talking people down from bridges to know that desperation is preventable. It's expensive and complicated and requires us to care about people we'll never meet. But it's preventable. The standing ovation surprised him. So did the dozens of people who approached afterward wanting to learn more, wanting to start their own programs, wanting to be part of building something better. A movement was growing, Jonah realized. He wasn't alone in believing that business could be done differently. 2 years after leaving Park Ventures, Jonah sat in his foundation office, smaller than his corporate office had been, but with better artwork courtesy of Maya's drawing talents. and reflected on how far he'd traveled from that night at Lumiere. The scared, hidden version of himself seemed like a different person now. He'd become someone visible, someone responsible, someone who accepted that he couldn't save everyone but refused to stop trying. His phone buzzed. A text from Trent Holloway, who'd completed the worker transition program and now worked as a supervisor at a Park Ventures manufacturing company, training new hires and serving on the company's worker advisory board. Just wanted to say thanks. Again. My daughter graduated college today. Wouldn't have happened without you giving us that second chance. You changed my whole family's story. Then a text from Maya, even though she was just in the next room doing homework. Mrs. Chen wants to know if you're bringing Miss Han to dinner tonight. Also, she made too much food again and needs help eating it. Then finally, a text from Celeste. Board meeting went well. We're expanding the cooperative model to 5 more companies. Richard almost smiled. Progress. Jonah looked at these messages, at the web of connections he'd built from a life that had once seemed completely broken. He thought about Sarah Martinez, who he still carried with him, but no longer as a weight, more as a reminder of why the work mattered. He thought about 4 angry men in a restaurant who could have destroyed lives but chose a different path. He thought about hundreds of workers who'd been told they were expendable and proved everyone wrong. But mostly, he thought about Maya's drawing that still hung on his office wall. The family of 3. 2 figures colored in completely now, a tall one and a small one standing together. And a 3rd figure, no longer just an outline but filled with color, smiling, connected. Someone else had shown up to fill that space. Several someones, actually. Celeste, Mrs. Chen, colleagues and friends, and workers whose lives had intersected with his in meaningful ways. The family Maya had been drawing wasn't just about blood relations or traditional structures. It was about people choosing to be present for each other, to build something together, to create connection in a world that often felt disconnected. Jonah picked up his phone and texted back. To Trent, congratulations to your daughter. You rebuilt your life. I just helped point the direction. To Maya, tell Mrs. Chen yes, and that she's not subtle. To Celeste, Richard smiled. That's terrifying. See you at 7. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. Somewhere down there, people were struggling with decisions that felt impossible. Somewhere, workers were being told they didn't matter. Somewhere, someone was standing on their own metaphorical bridge, trying to decide whether to jump. And Jonah was here, building systems to catch them. Not perfectly. He'd learned to accept that perfect wasn't possible. Not always successfully. He'd learned to accept failure as part of the process. But consistently, honestly, with the full weight of someone who understood exactly what happened when society decided some people were expendable. He'd spent 3 years invisible, hiding from the part of himself that cared too much and tried too hard. 3 years believing that Sarah Martinez's death meant he didn't deserve to help anyone else. But Maya had been right all along. Trying to help was always good, even when it didn't work. The mistake hadn't been caring too deeply. The mistake had been stopping. Now Jonah Carter stood in the light, visible and vulnerable and fully alive. A single father who'd learned to build family beyond biology. A former negotiator who'd found new ways to prevent crisis. A man who'd failed once and learned that failure didn't disqualify you from trying again. It taught you why success mattered. He had finally stopped running from who he was and stepped fully into who he was becoming. And for the first time in years, when Jonah smiled, it reached all the way up to his eyes, genuine and complete and absolutely real. The story of 4 angry men and a billionaire CEO had become the story of one quiet waiter who remembered he had a gift, who decided that gift was worth using, despite the risks and fears and possibility of failure, who chose connection over safety, visibility over hiding, hope over resignation, who learned that the bravest thing anyone can do is keep trying to help, even after they've failed before, and who proved that sometimes the most ordinary person, a waiter, a single dad, someone who'd spent years convinced he had nothing special to offer, could change everything simply by refusing to let anger turn into tragedy and pain turn into violence, by seeing people before they broke, by stepping into the fire one more time, by being exactly who the world needed, precisely when it needed him most.